If you want to apply for asylum in the United States, but you've got questions about how to fill out the asylum application form, then you're in the right place. I'm going to show you exactly how to fill out Form I-589, which is the government's asylum application form, in this full-length training video. We're going to go step by step, addressing everything on the form because it's critical that you get this right. The application is the first step on your road to asylum, and it's extremely important that you fill it out correctly and that you use it to frame your case in an impactful way. I'm Brian Manning, and I used to be an asylum officer with the government, but now, as an asylum lawyer, I help immigrants all over the country to secure their future in America through asylum. And in this immigration tutorial, I'm sharing with you all my best tips for filling out the asylum application form. Now, these insights that I'm sharing with you are informed by over a decade of my work with the government's two main agencies for refugee and asylum matters. And of course, by my time as an asylum lawyer now, helping people from all over the world to win their asylum case. And by the way, if you want to maximize your chances for asylum success, then be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell notification so that you don't miss the insights that I share on this channel. All right, let's go now to the training.
Welcome to the USA Asylum Application Form Training, where we're going to discuss Form I-589 in detail. By the end of this training, you should have a better understanding of what exactly the asylum application form is asking of you, and how to provide the information the form calls for. I believe that you'll feel much more confident in filling out this form after having watched this training. We're about to dive in and discuss the form, but first, let me say just a few words about some things to keep in mind during this training. And as you actually fill out the asylum application form yourself, we're going to go through the whole form. This may feel a bit tedious, and you may be tempted to skip over parts of this training, perhaps thinking that what we're discussing maybe doesn't apply to you, or that you just don't need to know whatever it is we're covering. Like, some of it may sound pretty basic, such that you're tempted to skip over it. I urge you not to do that. As a former government immigration officer, and now as an asylum lawyer, I can tell you that lots of people end up having problems with their immigration applications simply because they didn't pay enough attention to a question on a form, so they didn't give the information requested. Or maybe they just didn't understand something that didn't seem important, but really is. Don't let that happen to you. Be disciplined. Do whatever it takes to maintain your focus as we review this asylum application form and as you fill your application form out and prepare your application packet. As I think you'll agree by the end of this training, even some of the questions that seem innocent enough can actually be tricky, and there might be a lot more to it than you think at first glance. So be patient and focus with me as we go through this, okay? Great. Okay, before we dive in, let me tell you who this training is intended for. It's for anyone who wants to apply for asylum in the United States. And that means it's both for people who are in deportation proceedings and are thus going to be applying with an immigration court, and for people who are going to submit what's called an affirmative asylum application, which goes to an immigration agency called USCIS. And that acronym, by the way, USCIS, stands for U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is the entity that runs the asylum offices, which is where you'll have an asylum interview to have your claim considered if you are not subject to deportation proceedings in immigration court. Now, you're going to use the same asylum application form whether you're applying with USCIS or in immigration court. How you actually go about applying will differ depending on which of those tracks you're on. For example, most people who are going to apply with USCIS can actually apply online through the agency's web portal. With immigration court, at least at the time I'm making this training, there's no web-based application. Instead, people who don't have a lawyer just have to take or mail a physical version of the application form to the immigration court, while a lawyer is able to upload a PDF version of the application to a certain website for their client. I think everyone will eventually be able to apply online with both the immigration court and USCIS. All right, we're not going to go much further in this training on the logistics of applying for asylum, but are instead going to turn in just a minute to the application form itself. I want you to know what it's asking of you and how to frame your case so that you can get things started on the right foot. Having a well-crafted asylum application form is the first step in building the strongest asylum case possible so that you can win your case, so that you can stay safe and build your future in America. All right. At the outset, let me stress that you need to be honest and forthcoming in filling out this form, and indeed in all your representations to and dealings with immigration agencies. For starters, honesty is the best policy, just because being honest is the right ethical thing to do. But it's also the best strategic approach for trying to get the immigration benefit you're seeking. You see, there's a lot that the government will forgive. And yes, it's true that there are some things in a person's history that will prove a deal breaker. Things that will make you ineligible for the benefit you are seeking, pretty much no matter what. But then, there are other things that you may think will hurt your case, but which won't actually lead to a denial, as long as you're honest about them. So while there's a lot that the US government will tolerate, it normally will not tolerate lying to try to get an immigration benefit like asylum. So it's better to just be open and honest about everything than it is to lie or withhold information that's being asked for. If the government finds out or believes you're not being truthful, it will likely lead to your asylum claim being denied, and it can keep you from ever getting any immigration benefit in the United States in the future. Committing immigration fraud can lead to a monetary fine or even jail time. So you should be 100% honest and forthcoming, and not represent to the US government anything that could be misleading. And now, with all that out of the way, it's time to get started on the asylum application form, which again is called Form I-589. To find it, you can either type into your browser the URL that you're seeing on the screen right now, or you can just Google the phrase USCIS Asylum Application Form. If you search for that, you should see results like this, with the official USCIS link at the top of the page. You'll know it's an official US government website if it's got the .gov in the website URL. Click on that, and you'll get the page for the URL I showed you a second ago, which looks like this. Now, we're going to scroll down a bit until we get to the Form Details section, and then click on the part where it says Forms and Document Downloads. You'll then see a couple hyperlinks, one for the application form and another for the instructions. To get the form, click on the top link which says Form I-589. That should open up a fillable PDF version of the asylum application form. By the way, unless you're applying online, I strongly recommend accessing the application through the USCIS website like we just did. If you get it off some other website, or if someone perhaps just sends it to you, you might not be getting the most recent version of the form. You see, the government pretty frequently makes tweaks to immigration forms, and they'll reject your application if you don't submit the current version. If you get the form from the USCIS website, you'll know you're getting the current version. Also, if you're applying online with USCIS through the agency's web portal, then you'll be using the current version of the form. That process doesn't involve a PDF at all. Rather, you fill out what is basically an online questionnaire, and it builds your asylum application form for you. The final version that you get at the end of the process does look quite different from the PDF form that we're working with today, but the questions are the same. Well, I should say that they're almost the same. I've noticed some slight variations in the wording of some questions from the official PDF version, and the questions are also in a slightly different order. So, if you're doing your application online through the My USCIS application, some of the questions are going to be a tiny bit different than what you're seeing today in this training, and the questions might not be in the same order. Keep that in mind, okay? All right, here we go. Time to start on the form. Near the very top, it says, Start here. Type or print in black ink. See the instructions for information about eligibility and how to complete and file this application. There is no filing fee for this application. First, I urge you to type your answers. Don't print with an ink pen, okay? You may think your penmanship is beautiful, but it might not be legible to others. Also, it just kind of looks unprofessional, like you didn't care enough or take the process seriously enough to do this on a computer. If you do handwrite, it cannot be pencil, and it cannot be an ink pen that has a color other than black. It must be black. USCIS has rejected immigration forms filled out in red ink and even blue ink. And note the bit about how there's no fee for this form. Thankfully, applying for asylum is free. So if anyone, like some unethical paralegal, ever tries to get you to pay an asylum filing fee, claiming there's a government fee involved, you know they're trying to scam you. Okay, just below that line it says, Note, check this box if you also want to apply for withholding of removal under the Convention Against Torture. And there's a little box you can check. What is that? Well, in immigration court, if the judge is convinced that you'll be persecuted on account of one of the 5 protected grounds under U.S. asylum law, but you don't actually qualify for asylum for certain reasons, then they can allow you to stay. They can give you a form of protection called withholding of removal, which allows you to stay and work legally in the United States. It's not as good as asylum, but it's better than being deported. You might qualify for withholding of removal, but not asylum if you filed your asylum application after you've been in the United States for more than a year, or if you were resettled in a third country before you go to the United States. By checking this box, you're saying, yes, I want the judge to consider giving me this protection in the event that I don't qualify for asylum. Unfortunately, an asylum officer can't give this kind of protection to you. The only thing that they can consider is asylum. But if your case gets sent from the asylum office to immigration court because the asylum officer decides you don't qualify for asylum, then you'll want the judge to consider withholding of removal as an option for you. So there's really no reason not to check this box, whether you're in immigration court or your case is going to be with USCIS. Accordingly, I do recommend that you check this box. All right, that gets us to Part A1, Information about you. Okay, in Box 1, you're asked to provide your alien registration number, if in fact you have one. This is sometimes referred to as an A number or an immigration number or a USCIS number. So, what is this alien registration number? It's a 9 or sometimes 8 digits following after a capitalized letter A, which the immigration authorities assign to people with certain pending immigration cases. If you've ever applied for an immigration benefit other than a U.S. visa, then you have an alien registration number. If you've ever been detained by the immigration authorities or been placed in immigration court proceedings, then you have one of these. But if none of those apply to you, then you probably don't have an alien registration number. If you do have one, then it is included in any document you have received from the government on any immigration matter, except for visa applications. Here's one example. This is a document you get after you apply for asylum with USCIS, telling you that they've accepted and are processing your application. In the upper right-hand side here, right next to where it says applicant, you see the letter A followed by 9 digits. That's this fictitious person's alien registration number. That's not a real asylum applicant's name, or as far as I know, a real immigration number, by the way. So, back to our asylum application form. If you've got an alien registration number, put it here. The made-up alien registration number in the sample receipt notice I just showed you was A213849238. So I'm going to disregard that A at the beginning and then type in this box the 9 digits, which are 213849223 and 8. So what if you don't have an alien registration number? What do you do with this space? You should write the English language letter N and then put a / and then the letter A like this. That stands for not applicable, as in this doesn't apply to me because I don't have an alien registration number. And actually, this goes for every box on this form, and indeed on any immigration forms that you fill out where the question or instruction doesn't apply to you. I recommend not leaving any boxes blank and instead putting N/A if it doesn't apply to you, or unknown if it applies, but you just don't know and can't supply the information sought. This is because USCIS has in the past rejected some applications where there were answer spaces left blank. At the time I'm creating this training, USCIS has stopped this practice. They've said they won't reject forms just because there's a field left blank. But you never know. They could easily go back to the policy of rejecting applications that don't contain a response for every question or request. Okay, next, at number 2, you're asked for your U.S. Social Security number. Most asylum applicants don't have one of these. 150 days after applying for asylum, you're eligible to apply for both a work permit and a Social Security card, which will contain a Social Security number. But unless you've been in the United States on a business-related visa, you probably don't have this. Of course, if you do have one of these, then put it in this box. If not, write N/A. All right, on to number 3, which requests your USCIS online account number. This is an identifier you get if you've created an account through the USCIS portal called MyUSCIS. Most asylum seekers have not created such an account, but if you have, like if you sought some other immigration benefit, then of course put your USCIS account number here. Don't have this? You know what to do? Type N/A, and that takes us to your name at 4 through 7. 4 asks for your complete last name. Now I'm about to tell you something really important, and it applies not just in filling out this form, but for every form you fill out for any U.S. immigration agency, and for any time you represent your name to a U.S. government agency. You need to represent your name exactly as it appears on your passport, even if that's different from what's on your birth certificate, and even if that's different from what's on your national ID card, your driver's license, and even if it's different from what you actually go by in your everyday life. Even if your name is misspelled on your passport, That's the name you should use for U.S. immigration purposes, spelling it exactly the way it's spelled on your passport. So, do refer to your passport in filling out this form. See the section on this sample passport page that says surname? We're going to take the names that appear there, which are Rodriguez Cepeda in this example, and then type that in box 4 right here. Now, let me back off of what I said a second ago about reproducing the name exactly as it appears in your passport. You'll see that in this sample passport, the names are written in all capital letters. You don't need to use all capital letters in filling out your immigration forms. In fact, I recommend against it. Just capitalize the first letter in each part of your name, like this. If you've got multiple surnames, separate them with one space between them. In the next box, at 5, which says first name, put your first name as it appears in your passport. In our example, the person's first name is Jorge, so we'll put that in box 5. Box 6 is for your middle name if you have one. In our example, this would be Miguel. Even if you regularly go by 2 names, for example Juan Pablo, such that everyone calls you both of those names in referring to you, and you consider them both to essentially be your first name, you still just want to put Juan in the box for first name and Pablo in the box for middle name. Let's look at our example passport. You only put the very first word that appears in the passport's names section in the application forms box for first name. Put any additional names from the passport's names section in the application forms box for middle name. Even if there are more than one, if you have Del before your middle name, you would include that in box 6 for your middle name. So for example, if your names were Jorge Del Valle, then you'd put Del Valle in box 6 for your middle name. If you don't have a second name, write N/A in box 6. Next, at question 7, we're asked, what other names have you used? And specific examples of kinds of names they're inquiring about are aliases and maiden names. It's tempting to skip over this without much thought, thinking, I've never used a fake name or anything like that, so this doesn't apply to me. Don't do that. Many people have, in fact, used a name that's different from what appears on their passport, so they do need to include that information here. For example, if you've been in the United States a while and you've gotten any kind of identification document, whether for your job or school or maybe a driver's license, then there's a good chance that at least one of those items doesn't contain both of your last names if you've got 2 last names, or that there's something else that's different from what's on your passport. Your name may be rendered differently from your passport on things like your home or apartment lease documents, your electricity or telephone bills, or really any other document that lists your name. And if that's happened, if any document has ever shown a name different than what's shown on your passport, then you should include that variation or error in this box at number 7. Let's take the name Jorge Miguel Rodriguez Cepeda. If he got a driver's license, or if some other document shows his name as just Jorge Rodriguez, then he would need to include that here as an alias. That's because Jorge Rodriguez is a different name than Jorge Miguel Rodriguez Cepeda. Another very common scenario where someone would need to include an alias, or other name, is where a woman has changed her last name upon getting married. She would need to provide, as an alias, whichever of the 2 versions that's not how her name appears in her passport. This example is explicitly listed in the question at issue. So what about aliases? The question asks about those. What's an alias? It's defined as a false or assumed identity. This could include things like a pen name, which is when an author writes under a false name, or really any name you've gone by that isn't your real name. But it's not just totally made-up names you need to include here. You should also include variations on your real name, if you ever list them on things, or if people call you by them. An example of this is the short form of a name. So someone named Magdalena might commonly go by Lena. If she's commonly referred to as Lena, or if she introduces herself as Lena, then she should include Lena in this section as an alias. Okay, last thing before moving on. It's best to play it safe and provide too much information, rather than erring on the side of leaving things out. If you're unsure whether something counts as an other name used, then you should include it. Other than taking a bit more effort to fill out this form, there's really no downside to being over-inclusive. But if you don't provide certain information that the government ends up thinking is relevant, and they realize that this has happened, you could look bad. And you have no way of knowing what information about you the government has. I'm not saying the US government is all-knowing, but you may be surprised by what they find out about people. So, yes, the government might know about those other names that people have used to refer to you. And if you don't include it here, that's not good for you. And this advice holds not just with regard to other names used, but rather for all questions in all forms and in all your dealings with the immigration authorities. Honesty is the best policy. And if you're not sure whether certain information is responsive to the question being asked or the information being solicited, but you think it might be, then it's probably best to include it. Okay, moving right along. We're at number 8, which is residence in the US, and in parenthesis, it says where you actually reside. They're asking here where you live. They want your physical address. This may be different from your mailing address, which is where you want to receive mail. For number 8, regarding your physical address, you need to give the address of where you're actually living at the time you're submitting your asylum application. Okay, next first box asks for street number and name. To make sure you render your address correctly, in a format that is familiar to Americans, I recommend putting into Google whatever you believe your address to be. When you do that, and you hit Enter, Google will pull up Google Maps, and it will show you the address in the format that they think is best to use. People are sometimes unsure what words to abbreviate or perhaps unsure about how to spell the words and might not know what the zip code is. Just use what you see in Google Maps. That will almost certainly be in a format that USCIS, the immigration courts, and the US Postal Service, which will actually deliver the mail, should you mail your application, will recognize. And in this street number and name box, you'll put the number for your house, apartment complex, or whatever the case may be, followed by the name of the street on which it's found. Next, to the right, we're asked for apartment number. This bit applies to you if you in fact live in an apartment, a suite, or perhaps an entire floor in a building. By far, the most common of these is an apartment. If your address contains an apartment number, just type that number into the box here. If your address does not contain an apartment, a suite, or a floor, like if it's a house, then just write N/A in the box to signify that this isn't applicable to you. Okay, next up in filling out your physical address, we're asked to list the city in which you live. This one's easy. You know this. So that takes us to the state. It's okay to write out the whole name of your state here, or you can use the 2-letter abbreviation for the state. If you're filling out your asylum application online through the USCIS portal, you'll have to select the state abbreviation from a drop-down, so you do need to know how your state is abbreviated. To ensure you select the right one, go back to Google Maps. The address rendered there will show you the proper abbreviation. To give just a few examples, Florida is FL, while Texas is TX, California is CA, while New York is NY, and Illinois is IL. Okay, next up, zip code. You must type in the 5-digit postal code that follows the state abbreviation in your address. You can find this on Google Maps. Also, if you've received mail at your physical address, then you should be able to locate on the envelope the zip code for your address, as that's part of the address that the sender of the letter had to include to get the mail to you. And now moving on, we're asked for our telephone number. You need to provide a US phone number at which you can in fact be reached. Note that it's unlikely that USCIS will ever call you, but you do still need to provide a working phone number just in case they do call. In providing your number here, you do not need to include the country code. Rather, just include the 10 digits that someone will need to dial from within the United States to call you. In the little part within the parenthesis, you put the first 3 digits. This is known as your area code, and it's the first part of your phone number. Then, to the right of that, put the next 7 digits. Okay, with that, we're done with number 8, regarding your residence, and are ready for number 9. Number 9 says, mailing address in the US, if different than the address in item number 8. How this works is that you definitely do have to list an address at number 8. But if that address is indeed where you get your mail, then you don't have to reproduce it again at number 9. Rather, if your mailing address and your physical address, where you actually live, are the same, then you can just write N/A in each box for number 9. But if those 2 addresses for you are different, if you want USCIS to send mail to an address other than the one at which you live, then you do need to provide your mailing address here for number 9. All the same guidance I provided in terms of how to render your physical address applies here, except you're putting your mailing address where you want correspondence from the government to be sent. It's really important that you provide the government with an address where you know you'll actually end up getting something that's mailed for you. It should be a place where someone checks the mail routinely, at least every couple days, and can inform you as soon as something addressed to you arrives. You see, if the government has questions about your application and wants you to provide more information, or if they reject your application, they'll let you know about this by mail. They might not call you, and they almost certainly won't send you an email. they'll send physical mail. Also, the government will use this information to mail you the notice that says you need to go to a biometrics appointment, which happens after you apply for asylum. And if you don't receive a letter from the government because you never actually got the letter they sent, then you could miss a deadline or appointment they set, and they can deny your application. Indeed, if you miss an appointment with USCIS, they can put you in deportation proceedings, and if you miss an appointment with the immigration court, they can enter an order of deportation against you. So if things are hectic at your house, and there's a chance some mail might get lost or missed, then you can consider having it sent elsewhere, like to a friend or relative. That's why the first box under number 9 says, in care of, if applicable. You're supposed to put here the name of whomever you want the government to address mail for you to, and it's okay if it's someone other than you. So, put here the name of the person to whom you want your mail from the government to be addressed. Put their first name and their last name, or assuming they've got 2 last names, both last names. If you want mail from USCIS to be addressed to you, then put your name here. All right, on to number 10, which asks for your gender. Select male or female by putting an X in the corresponding box. I think it's perfectly fine for a transgendered or transitioning person to mark the sex with which they now identify, rather than their sex at birth. Number 11 asks for marital status. You will select from single, married, divorced, or widowed by placing an X in the corresponding box. Please note that if you are separated from your spouse, but not yet legally divorced, you should choose the married option. If you were married, but then got legally divorced, you should select divorced, despite that single might seem like an appropriate option. If you got divorced or were widowed and then got remarried, you should select married and do not check the boxes for divorced or widowed. I'll say more in a while about how the US government defines marriage in the immigration context. Okay, for number 12, enter your date of birth. Now, this might sound odd, but some people aren't sure of their birth date, or might have an incorrect date listed on some of their personal documentation. If you're not positive of the correct date, then use the birth date that appears on your passport. If you know your date of birth, and it's something other than what appears on your passport, then use your real date of birth, even though this will conflict with your passport. Yes, I know that earlier I emphasized that you should render your name exactly as it appears on your passport. And now I'm telling you that you should use your real date of birth even if it conflicts with your passport. This might seem like an arbitrary distinction, but it is in fact my preferred approach, informed by years of experience as both an asylum officer and an asylum lawyer. If you do indicate a different date of birth than what's on your passport, be ready to explain to the government why these 2 dates aren't in harmony. In providing your date of birth, and indeed all dates in your application form, remember to use the month, day, year construction that's the norm in the United States. So if my date of birth were the 3rd of December 1988, I would put in this box 12 for December, then type a slash, then 03 for the day of the month on which I was born, then another slash, and then 1988. Okay, moving on. The next question, number 13, asks for your city and country of birth. You'll put here the name of the city you were born in, then put a comma, make 1 space, and then type the name of the country in which you were born. So, if our sample applicant, Jorge, was born in the city of Caracas, which is in the country of Venezuela, he'd type Caracas, Venezuela. Same guidance here as with the date of birth issue. Do put here the true city and country in which you were born, even if that conflicts with what's shown in your passport, birth certificate, or other documentation. One more note on this question. The government's instructions for the asylum application form say that you should use the current name of the country. Do not use historical, ethnic, provincial, or other local names. Okay, at 14, we're asked about present nationality. The word present is meant to signify that they're not asking here about any nationalities you may have previously held. They just want to know about current nationalities. And yes, I did say nationalities in the plural, despite that the prompt in the application form says nationality in singular form. I advise that you list here every nationality you currently hold if you have more than one. Note that the instruction refers to nationality, but then says citizenship in parenthesis, as if they're treating these 2 words as synonyms. Under US immigration law, there is a difference between citizenship and nationality, but it's really complicated and not worth going into here. Suffice it to say that you should list any country here whose passport you hold, or for which you know you're a citizen, even if you don't have that country's passport, and even if you've never been there or don't have any meaningful ties there. What matters for purposes of this question is not how you feel about that country. It's whether that country considers you, under its laws, to be one of its citizens or nationals. So there are people who don't have a country's passport and don't have any history in their own life with that country, but who need to list it here, because they are in fact a citizen or national of it. This may happen where citizenship is passed down from parents or even grandparents, for example. Keep in mind that being born in a country doesn't necessarily make you a citizen of that country. Also, note that this question is not asking about permanent residence or any other immigration status in a country. So you only list a country here if you're actually a citizen or national of the country. One last note on this question about citizenship or nationality. Some people simply don't have any citizenship or nationality. They are what's called stateless, meaning no country claims that person as their own. If that's you, you're probably already aware that you're in this position. If that's you, you should write the word stateless in this box. Our example applicant, Jorge, is a citizen of Venezuela, right? But let's say he's also a citizen of Spain. So in this box for 14, he would put Venezuelan, Spanish. It's totally fine to state it as a noun rather than treating it as an adjective. So Venezuela and Spain would be fine. Okay, next up at number 15, it says nationality at birth. It doesn't say citizenship in parentheses, but we should treat this like we did the last question. You should list here any country of which you were a citizen or national at the moment of your birth. It doesn't matter whether you currently hold a given nationality or citizenship. This question is only asking about the time of your birth. Note that if you had a citizenship or nationality at some point, other than when you were born and do not have it now, then you wouldn't need to list in this application form because the form is only asking about those two moments in time, your birth and now, meaning the time at which you're submitting your asylum application. All right, with that, we're ready for 16, which asks for your race and any ethnic or tribal groups to which you belong. If you identify with a particular race or ethnicity, put that here. Those two terms, race and ethnicity, aren't defined in the form's instructions, and they aren't really well defined elsewhere or understood in general. These are terms that Americans throw around a lot, but which are kind of foreign to many other cultures, so you might not know what to make of this. Don't worry, there's really no wrong answer here. The government treats this as one of those things where whatever you consider yourself to be is what you are. In this box, it's common to put things like white or black, or Caucasian or Asian. People from the Spanish-speaking world will often put Hispanic here. If you belong to a tribe, do state the name of it here. You can either put just the tribe, or you can list both your race/ethnicity and your tribe. It's up to you. Next, we've got religion at 17. This is another of those where there's no objectively correct answer. If you consider yourself to be religious, then state your religion here. If you don't consider yourself to be religious, then you can either type the word none or put N/A. What about people who were born or raised in a religious family, but either change religions or do not consider themselves to currently be a religious person? Well, for the latter category, people who are no longer religious, I would suggest putting none or N/A. But if you changed religions, then I would put your current religion. No need to list any prior religion. If you're not religious, but a religion forms a strong part of your identity, I think it's fine to either list that religion here, even though you don't really consider yourself to be a believer, or to put none or N/A. It's up to you. For example, someone from a Muslim family may not consider themselves to be religious, or who is somewhat religious but not actively practicing the religion, may want to go ahead and put Islam here if the religion is a key component of their cultural identity. If your asylum claim turns on religion, if you fear being harmed because of your religion, then you definitely do want to take care to correctly identify your religion here. Okay, we're at number 18, which asks us to check one of three boxes, A, B, or C. This is getting at whether you've ever been in immigration court proceedings. What does that mean? Well, if you've ever gotten a letter from the government that says you need to go to immigration court for a hearing because the Department of Homeland Security is trying to deport you, then you either are in, or at least have in the past been in immigration court proceedings. Immigration court proceedings is basically a synonym for deportation proceedings. These start when a document called a notice to appear is filed with an immigration court by the Department of Homeland Security, which is known by its acronym DHS. Option A says, I have never been in immigration court proceedings. If you're sure you've never received a notice to appear, then mark this option. Option B is for people who are currently in immigration court proceedings. If you have a case pending before the immigration court, you need to check this box. even if you haven't yet had a hearing or if no hearings are presently scheduled. Finally, option C says, I am not now in immigration court proceedings, but I have been in the past. This is for people who had a prior matter before the immigration court, but ended, and there's no case for them pending at present in immigration court. A case can end in immigration court where a judge orders someone deported or grants them a benefit, like something called cancellation of removal. A case can also end by way of dismissal, where it just gets terminated. So, mark the option that applies to you, and then you're ready to move on to number 19. This is about your departure from your own country and your entries into the United States. So, subpart A asks when you last left your country. They want to know the date, in month, day, year format, on which you last left the country of which you're a citizen. They're not asking here about when you left any other country you might have been in right before coming to the United States. They want to know when you last departed your own country. For this and the other parts we're looking at in this question, you may need to consult old travel records to try to pin these dates down with certainty. You really don't want to guess or estimate on these dates if you can help it. This may necessitate looking up entry or exit stamps in your passport, or maybe emails or text messages you got regarding flight details for any planes you took. The date on which you last left your country and the date on which you most recently entered the United States are very important. Other prior entries to the United States aren't quite as critical in terms of ensuring you've got the exact date correctly stated. Now, let's talk about subpart B, which says, what is your current I-94 number, if any? Let me explain what this is asking for. If you entered the United States with a visa or came to the border and were paroled into the country, then you probably have an I-94. Sometimes this is just issued electronically, but sometimes people are given a little white card called an I-94 arrival and departure record. If you came to the border to seek asylum and were detained, you probably don't have one of these cards or the corresponding I-94 record. But again, if you were paroled in, you could have one. If you arrived in the United States at an airport, you should be able to obtain an electronic version of Form I-94. This will show you your I-94 arrival departure record number, as well as your entry date. You can use the URL that's on the screen now to go to the government's website where you can get your I-94. If something changes and this URL doesn't work, then you can just Google CBP I-94, and that should get you to the right place. Click on the tab near the top where it says, Get Most Recent I-94 section. You'll then have to agree to the terms of use for the website. Once you do that, you'll be taken to a page that looks like this. On this page, you'll need your passport information, as you'll enter it, along with your biographical information, to get the electronic version of your I-94. It will look something like this. I've drawn a red circle around some of the key information for your immigration application. This includes your I-94 admission number. That's the one that says Admission I-94 Record Number. It's the string that starts with a 2 and ends with a 2 as well. This is the number you're going to put at question 19, subpart B, in your asylum application. On the I-94, below the admission number is the date of your most recent entry. In this example, Form I-94, you can see that the date of entry is August 13th, 2019. Next, it shows your class of admission. This is the immigration status they gave you upon entry. It normally tracks with your visa classification, but not always. In this sample I-94, the class of admission says B2. That's the classification for a visitor for pleasure, which includes things like tourism or visiting friends or family, as well as getting medical treatment or doing business-related activities. Below that is the Admit Until Date. That's the date by which you need to leave the country. In this sample I-94, it's February 12th, 2020. For certain classes of admission, there won't be a date here, but rather the letter D, and then a slash, and the letter S. This means duration of status, which basically means that you can stay as long as you're maintaining your immigration status. If you came on a student visa, this likely applies to you. You'll want to print this form and include it with your asylum application, by the way. Some people get a little white card when they come into the United States that says in the lower right-hand corner, CBP Form I-94, and it says Arrival Record in the upper left corner. This is the physical version of the I-94, which the US government is moving away from issuing in favor of just doing an electronic version online. But still, some people have this. It looks like this. If you do have this, it will provide information we need for your application form. And you should make a copy of it and submit that copy with your asylum application materials. So that's an overview of the I-94. Let's go back to the asylum application form. Take the I-94 admission number that you just found and put it at question 19, subpart B. And with that, we're ready for subpart C, which says you must list each entry into the U.S. beginning with your most recent entry. It then says to list each date, place, and your status for each entry. So, in the first blank, next to the little letter C, you've got to put the date of your most recent arrival in the United States. Where do you find this information? Well, recall that it's in the I-94 that we just discussed. So look for it there if you're able to access your I-94 online, or if you have a physical I-94 card. If you're unable to do that, and you used a passport to enter the country, as opposed to entering by crossing the border illegally, there should be a stamp in your passport from the people at immigration in the airport, or at the border checkpoint. That stamp, which will likely be next to the passport page containing your U.S. visa, will have the date of your entry on it. If you don't have or can't access your I-94, and you don't have a passport or don't have an entry stamp in your passport, what do? Well, if you know the exact date that you entered into the United States, that is the date you will put down here. If you are not sure about the exact date that you entered the United States, please enter your best estimate as your answer. Moving over to the right, you're asked to list the place of your most recent entry into the United States. This is referring to the border crossing or airport where you came into the United States. For most people, what will go in this box is the name of the airport you flew into. If you flew into one airport, but then had a connecting flight to a different airport, the one you want to list here is the first airport you came to in the United States. That's where you went through immigration and were admitted into the country. How do you find this information? Well, if you don't know the name of the airport you flew into, just Google for it. If you know it was Atlanta, Google Atlanta International Airport, and you should see the name of the airport as well as the city and state in which it's located. But if there are multiple airports in a city and you can't remember which you flew into, let's say in the New York or Washington, D.C. areas, then you'd need to do some checking in your records. Look for old emails or other correspondence, like perhaps messages from the airline you flew on, to see if you can determine the airport where you arrived in the United States. Once you know that, Google to get the city and state where it's located, and enter that info. So let's say you flew into Miami. You could Google Miami Airport, and you'd see that the first result is Miami International Airport. That's the official name of the main airport in Miami where international flights arrive. If you click on Miami International Airport, you'll see over to the right the address. You'll see that it's located in Miami, and the state is FL, which is short for Florida. So in this space, you can write Miami, Florida. Note that you can't just assume that an airport is located in a given city just because that city's name is used in the name of the airport. For example, Washington Dulles International Airport is in the Washington, D.C. area, but it's not actually in D.C. If you Google Washington Dulles International Airport, you'll see that it's actually in a city called Dulles, in the state of Virginia. So do check to see where the airport you arrived at is actually located, even if you think you know. If you came from Mexico to a border checkpoint, then enter the name of the city in the United States where that checkpoint is located. For example, if it was the one at Hidalgo, Texas, then you'd write Hidalgo, Texas here. If you entered illegally and weren't caught by immigration officials, then put the name of the first U.S. city you saw after you crossed. If you just don't know or don't remember, then put unknown in this box. Okay, we're still at number 19, subpart C, and now we're ready to provide the status. This refers to immigration status. They're asking about the immigration you had when you entered the United States. They want to know the immigration classification you were admitted under. If you came to the United States with a visa, then you can find your immigration status granted upon entry on the form I-94. On the electronic version, you're looking for the line that says class of admission. There should be a letter and a number printed out to the right. Rather than writing out tourist status or business visa or whatever, I recommend writing the letter and number that comes after class of admission on your I-94. That will take out the guesswork for you, and it will tell the immigration officer reviewing your application the precise status you were admitted in. For people who came to the United States on a tourist visa, this will almost certainly be B2. If that's you, just write B-2 in this box. Note that this isn't asking what your current status is. If you came on a tourist visa, we're admitted for 6 months, which is very often the period of stay that's granted, and you're filling out your asylum application a year after having been admitted, then you probably don't have lawful status. But you don't have to speak to that here, because this is asking what your status was when you last entered the United States. So you'd put B-2. If you came through Mexico to the US border and asked for asylum, you may have been paroled into the country. That basically means that you didn't have valid documents to enter, but they let you in anyway so that you could pursue your asylum claim and gave you an I-94, on which they wrote the word paroled. If that's you, put humanitarian parole in this box. If you crossed the border and didn't present yourself to a border official and you weren't caught, then you weren't admitted into the United States in a lawful status. In that case, write no status in this space. The same is true if you did have contact at or shortly after entry with the authorities, but they released you without giving you an I-94. In that case, you should write no status right here. All right, a little further to the right, the form says date status expires. This is asking when the status that you entered on for your most recent entry expired or is set to expire. This one can be a bit tricky, because determining someone's immigration status can actually be really complicated under US immigration law. If you know that you've still got valid status, like if you came on a tourist visa, were admitted under the B2 classification for 6 months, you haven't done anything to violate your status like work illegally, and you're applying for asylum after having been here just 3 months, then go ahead and list that expiration date here in this space. Remember to use the month, day, year format. If you came to the border and were paroled, your I-94 should say on it the date on which your parole status ends. Put that date here. If you never had lawful status to begin with, or if you had it but your period of admission expired, and you didn't extend it or apply for and get any other immigration benefit, then you should put no status here. All right, if you've entered the United States on any other occasions, you need to tell the government about them. That's what the 2 lines below are for. You'll see that they ask for the date, place, and status of any such entries. Be sure to go in reverse chronological order. So the top line should be your most recent entry, and then the line below it should be your second most recent entry, like the entry closest in time to your most recent entry. Accordingly, for each entry, just do the same thing we already discussed for your most recent entry in terms of providing details for the date and place of your entry and the status in which you were admitted. Note that your most recent entry is the only one for which you need to provide the expiration date of your status. You don't have to list this for other entries. Now, there are just 2 lines here on page 1 where you can list additional entries, right? So, there's space for a total of 3 entries to the United States. What if you've entered more times than that? What should you do? Well, this is where the continuation page comes in. If we go down to page 12, we'll see the words Supplement B, Form I-589 in the upper right-hand corner. This is where you're going to put information about the prior entries beyond your 3 most recent entries. You're also going to put here any other information that doesn't fit in the boxes up above for all questions except those related to some of your children. I'll say more about that when we get to your children. So on this page, page 12, you'll see that at the top, you've got to put your A number, the date on which you're finalizing your application form, and your name. Also, you've got to sign it. I recommend that you fill out this information both at the top of page 12 and at the top of page 11, even if you don't actually provide any other information on these pages. One word on the applicant's name box, because this is a little different format than what we saw on page 1 where we were asked to put different parts of our name in different boxes. At pages 11 and 12, you're asked to put your whole name in a single box. So, put your first name and any middle names, followed by your last name or names. You do not need to put your last name or names, then a comma, then your first name. Okay, so how would you use this page if you needed to provide information about a 4th entry to the United States, since there was only space for 3 entries up on page 1? To start, we've got to tell them which questions we're providing the additional information for. You see, just below the part we were talking about where it asks for your name and signature, it says part and question. So we've got to go back up to page 1 and see what part the stuff about entries to the United States was on, as well as the specific question we're now addressing. So let's go back to page 1 to check. It looks like it's part A1. And the question we're answering is number 19C. All right. So we'll go back down to page 12, and out next to the word part, we'll type A, period, capital I, because that's how they styled it up above on page 1. Then below that, next to the word question, we'll type 19 period C. Then in the blank space below, just type out the same information that we provided for the entries on page 1. Provide the date, place, and status you had at each entry. You do not need to write out the words date, place, and status. Instead, just provide the information requested. So if you entered at San Francisco International Airport as a student on February 1st, 2023, you could write 02, 01, 2023. Then do a space, and then type a dash. Then make another space, and then type San Francisco, CA, followed by a space, then a dash, and then F-1. Got it? Great. If you've got additional entries, just drop down a couple lines and do the same thing, and keep doing that until you've addressed every entry. Before finishing up with the entries, let me acknowledge that sometimes people have made many entries to the United States, and they just don't remember the details for all of them and can't find any kind of record with this information. That's understandable. Just do your best to provide as much information as you can for as many entries as you can. If you're estimating on the date, you can type in just the month and year and not put the specific day. Okay, with that, we're ready to go back up to page 1, where we're going to move on to number 20. This one is much easier. The question is, what country issued your last passport or travel document? Don't let the bit about the travel document confuse you. This applies to very few people. You can think of this as asking just about your passport. So just list the country that gave you your passport. If you have passports from different countries, then just list whichever you received most recently, since the question asks specifically about your last passport. At 21, you need to put your passport number. You can find this on the data page of your passport. That's the page that contains your photograph on it. There should be a part that says something like Passport N.O., like you can see in the upper right-hand side of our sample passport here. If you have a passport, then just below the space for number 21, out next to where it says Travel Document Number, put N-A, because you don't have a travel document number. To be clear, the travel document number they're asking about here has nothing to do with your passport. Okay, to the right, we've got number 22, which asked for your passport's expiration date. You can find that too on your passport data page. In our sample passport, we see it kind of on the lower left-hand side next to the photo. It says date of expiry. Your passport might use a word other than expiry like expiration. Alternatively, your passport might say valid until to show when the passport expires. Put that date in month, day, year format in the space at 22. If you've never been issued a passport, then just put N/A for 20, both parts of 21, and for 22. And with that, we're at number 23. This question asks, what is your native language? And then in parenthesis, it says, include dialect, if applicable. If you speak one language, then the answer to this question is obvious. List the language you speak here. If you speak multiple languages, then I think you should put here the language that you currently speak best. It's true that this might not technically be your native language, but that's okay. What they really want to know here is what language you understand and speak the very best. If you speak multiple languages equally well, then go with the one that you spoke in the house with your family when you were growing up. Okay, 24 asks, are you fluent in English? There's no clear cutoff for how well you have to speak a language for you to be considered fluent in it. This is a pretty subjective thing. There's no widely accepted definition of fluent when it comes to languages. If you understand spoken English really well and you're comfortable holding fairly extensive conversations in it, meaning you can also produce, not just comprehend, then it's fine to check the box for yes to say you're fluent. Note that checking the box here to say yes, I'm fluent, does not oblige you to then speak English at your asylum interview or court hearings. It's perfectly fine to signify that you're fluent in English, but then opt to speak your own language and use interpretation when it's time for your hearings or interview. Doing this will not look bad or somehow harm your case. Okay, so check yes or no here based on your own assessment of your level of English language fluency. And then we're ready for number 25. It asks, what other languages do you speak fluently? This is asking about languages other than your native language and English. If you do speak other languages pretty well, but you're not positive you're fluent in them, then use the same standard we discussed in assessing your English language fluency. And if you think you're fluent in them, list them here. If there are multiple languages, list them one by one, with a comma after each one, followed by a space. By the way, while we're talking about language, it bears stating what might seem obvious, but I'm telling you, as an asylum officer, I saw people do this wrong all the time. You need to render your answers in English. That includes not just the longer, narrative stuff we're going to get to later, but also the one-word answers and other short responses you're giving in the first few pages of the application. All right, immediately below the section we've been working in, there are additional sections that we're not going to fill out. On the left, it says for EOIR use only, and on the right, it says for USCIS use only. This means that these two boxes are for the immigration court and agency to fill out, not you, as the applicant. So leave these parts blank. Do not write N/A or anything at all in them. And with that, we've completed page 1, and along with it, part A1. Nice work! The next page is going to go much quicker, I assure you. Page 2 is for part A2, titled Information about Your Spouse and Children. Are you ready to get started on it? Here we go. Before we get to number 1, we've got to consider the text at the top of the boxes. It says your spouse, and then to the right, there's a box you can check that says, I am not married. And then in parenthesis, skip to your children, below. You're meant to check this box if you are not in fact married, in which case you don't need to fill out 1 through 24 in this spouse section. If you're not married, then put a check in the box. I do recommend that, if you're not married, you still go ahead and put N/A in each of these spaces into which you can place text. Now, before we address what's being asked for in terms of information about your spouse, let's talk about the definition of married for purposes of this form. It may seem like this is an obvious thing, but it can actually prove kind of tricky. The US government only considers you to be married if you are considered legally married by your country or some other country in which you may have gotten married, or if you are married under the laws of a US state. So if you had some kind of marriage ceremony and got an official license from a government entity in your country, and you haven't gotten formally divorced, then you are married as far as the US government is concerned. But there are lots of people who haven't formally gotten married, but who carry on as married people tend to carry on, such as by living together for a long time and perhaps having kids together. Whether this counts as being married for purposes of US immigration matters depends on whether your own country legally considers this kind of common law marriage to be a legal, valid marriage, like whether your country considers you to be married under its own laws. And answering that question can actually be difficult. If you don't have some kind of formal recognition by your country or another country in which you had a marriage ceremony, then you probably need to check the box to signify that you are not married. If that's you, and you want to include your partner as a dependent in your asylum claim to have them be part of your application, then you should get married in the United States. More on that in a minute. Okay, last thing on marital status. If you're married, it doesn't matter whether your spouse is in the United States or not, and it doesn't matter whether you've been living apart for a long time. You are married for purposes of the asylum application form if you were legally married and have never formally gotten divorced. Sometimes people will think, oh, my spouse and I haven't lived together in many years and I haven't even talked to them in years, so I don't really consider myself to be married. And so they will indicate here that they're not married. That's not good. The US government would consider a person in this position to be married and may think they're lying to try to hide something if the person says they're not married. Okay, with that, let's go through what information you need to provide if you are in fact married. Don't worry, this won't take long. At number 1, you put their alien registration number, if they have one. At 2, you're asked to put your spouse's passport or ID card number, if they have one. If they have a passport, put their passport number here. If they don't have a passport, but they have a national ID, then use their national ID number. Next, at 3, put their date of birth, ensuring to use the month, day, year format. Number 4 asks for your spouse's US Social Security number if they have one. At 5, you're going to put their complete last name or last names if they have multiple last names. Then at 6 and 7, you're putting their first and middle names respectively, just like you did for yourself. And like we discussed earlier when talking about rendering your own name, your spouse's name should look exactly like it looks in your spouse's passport. At 8, you'll put other names used by your spouse, including their maiden name and any aliases, if those things apply. So, same guidance we already discussed for you applies here for your spouse. At number 9, you must put your date of marriage. Put the date on which you became legally married. Moving along, at 10, you must indicate the place of marriage. I recommend putting the city in which you got married with a comma after it, then make a space, and type the name of the country, okay? For number 11, you must list your spouse's city and country of birth. Next, at 12, you put your spouse's nationality. Just like we discussed for yourself, for your spouse, you'll want to list all countries of citizenship. Note that this is asking about current citizenship. It's not asking about their citizenship at birth. All right, at 13, we've got the thing about race or ethnic or tribal group, like we discussed earlier for you. So, provide this information for your spouse, going by whatever your spouse considers their race or ethnicity to be, or if they've got a tribal affiliation, their tribe. Then, over at 14, check the appropriate box to indicate your spouse's gender. Male is on the left, and female is on the right. All right, at 15, you're asked, is this person in the US? Why are you being asked this? Well, in order for them to be a dependent in your case, they must be in the United States. Now, to be included in your case, they don't actually have to be in the United States at the time you submit your asylum application. They just need to be in the country before you are actually granted asylum. But still, the US government wants to know, at the time you're submitting your application, whether your spouse is here or not. So, answer accordingly, dictated by your spouse's location at the time you're submitting this asylum application form. If they are in the United States, then check the box for yes on the left, and then continue to answer questions 16 through 24. If your spouse is not in the United States, then check the box before the word no. Then, in the space out to the right of that word, you're asked to specify your spouse's location. Write in the name of the city in which they're living, then put a comma, do one space, then put the country. If you checked no, because your spouse is not in the United States, then you can skip 16 through 24. Just put N/A in all the spaces where text goes. But if your spouse is in the United States, such that you check the box for yes, then at 16, you've got to list their place of last entry into the US. So like you did for yourself earlier, list the city and US state where your spouse most recently entered the United States. Then, at 17, put the date of that entry, and at 18, put your spouse's I-94 number if they were admitted or paroled into the United States. At 19, list their immigration status upon entry. Next, at 20, the question is, what is your spouse's current status? Which of course refers to their immigration status. So follow for your spouse the same guidance I gave for assessing your own immigration status, and put the answer here, at 20. Then, at 21, in month, day, year format, put the expiration date of the status they got when they last entered the country, if they in fact entered with legal status. For 22, you're asked, is your spouse in immigration court proceedings? You'll recall that there was a similar question asked of you earlier. Follow my guidance to determine whether your spouse is currently in immigration court proceedings, then check the appropriate box here. Yes is on the left, and no is on the right. Okay, at 23, you're asked to list the dates of any prior entries your spouse made into the United States. So we're concerned here not with the most recent entry, but any entries before that. List those dates here, if any. Separate them by commas and use the continuation page 12 if you can't fit all the dates into this space. If your spouse crossed the border illegally, or if they came to the southern border and turned theirself in and were released but not paroled into the country, then you'd put N/A for 18 and 19, then none at 20, then N/A at 21. Okay, number 24 is important. It says, if in the US, is your spouse to be included in this application? And it asks you to check yes or no. If your spouse is not in the United States, ignore this. Just leave it blank. But if they are in the country, you have to decide whether you want to be what's called a dependent in your asylum claim. What does that mean? Well, if your spouse is a dependent in your claim, it means that they will get asylee status through you, assuming you win your case. And that happens automatically. They get this status at the exact same time as you do if they are included as a dependent in your case. To be clear, the asylum officer or judge will not assess whether your spouse meets all the requirements for asylum if they're a dependent in your claim. The government is really only interested in you as the principal asylum applicant, but your spouse would need to go with you to your asylum interview or any court hearings, and they may have to answer some security-related questions. Basically, are you a criminal or terrorist? Asked like 15 different ways. But they won't be asked questions about your underlying asylum claim. Note that including your spouse as a dependent in your claim entitles them to get a work permit and social security card based on your pending asylum claim, just like you can get. You, your spouse, and any children who are dependents in your claim can apply for the work permit and social security card 150 days after you've applied for asylum. So if your spouse and children can get asylum through you if you win, and they can also get a work permit while the case is pending, why would you perhaps not want to include them as dependents in your case? Well, there is some risk here if you're applying for asylum affirmatively with USCIS. If your spouse or children are included in your claim and you get a negative decision, all of you will be placed in deportation proceedings if you and they don't have legal immigration status at the time that negative decision is made by USCIS. If you were to choose not to include them as dependents, you would still get sent to immigration court upon receiving a negative decision from USCIS, but they would not. So you can shield them from possibly being placed in deportation proceedings by electing not to include them as dependents in your case. What are the downsides to that? Well, they won't be able to get a work permit based on your pending asylum claim, and they won't get asylum status immediately upon you winning asylum. Thankfully, though, they can still get asylee status through you. It just takes longer. If they weren't included as a dependent in your case, you would have to do a special petition for them after you win asylum. The problem is that it's currently taking USCIS well over a year to make a decision on that type of petition. So during that time, your family member is in limbo. You may want to talk to an asylum lawyer before deciding whether to include your family member as a dependent in your case. Note that if you're applying for asylum affirmatively, but your spouse or child is in immigration court proceedings, then you cannot include them as a dependent in your claim. You would need to mark the box for no. The same is true if you are in immigration court proceedings, such that you're applying for asylum in immigration court, but your spouse, or child as the case may be, is not in immigration court proceedings. In that scenario, they can't be a dependent in your asylum case. So to be included in your claim, you have to be in the same track as your family member. You have to either both be in immigration court proceedings, or you have to both be on the USCIS track, meaning you're not in immigration court proceedings. Got it? Great. And with that, we're ready to move on to the part about children. The form says list all of your children, regardless of age, location, or marital status. It's important to follow that instruction. Sometimes people think, oh, I've got a child who isn't in the United States and hasn't lived with me in many years, and I really didn't raise them, so I don't think I need to list them here. That's not the right way to go about this. As the instruction says, you need to list all of your children. The only exception is, in my opinion, a child who has died. In that situation, I think it's fine to leave them out, but I also think it's fine to include them here if you want to. All right, if you don't have any kids, check the box here next to the words, I do not have any children. You can then skip all the way to the top of page 4. But, as always, I recommend putting N/A in all the boxes up to that point in which you can add text. If you do have children, check the box next to the words, I have children. Then, out to the right, on the space next to the words total number of children, indicate how many kids you have. Just below that, in parentheses, it tells you to use Supplement A, which is page 11 of this form. If you've got more children, then we'll fit at pages 2 and 3. There's a space for one child on page 2, and then for 3 more children on page 3, for a total of 4 children. So, if you've got 5 or more children, you'll need to use page 11, which asks for the same information about your kids that we're about to discuss here, for page 2. There's space on page 11 for 2 more children. So if you have more than 6 children total, you'll need to put the information for those children elsewhere. If there's room on page 12 for that, then you can put it there. If there's not, then I recommend printing out an additional copy of page 11 and putting it after page 12. If you're applying online through the USCIS portal, then this won't be a problem. Okay, on page 2, near the bottom, we're ready to start providing information for your first child. By the way, if you have more than one child, I recommend going in reverse chronological order, meaning you'll start with your oldest child and work your way back to your youngest. This is going to be similar to the information solicited for your spouse, which we already covered. Therefore, we're not going to go cover each of these items from 1 to 21 for your children. Just know that the same guidance regarding adding your spouse as a dependent applies with regard to your children. It's your choice whether to include children in your claim, as long as they are in the United States, and meet the definition of a child for U.S. immigration law purposes. You see, to be included as a dependent, your child must be under age 21 at the time you submit your asylum application, and they must be unmarried and remain unmarried through the time that you're actually granted asylum. Not a problem if they turn 21 while your case is pending. All that matters in terms of age is that they were under 21 when the government accepts your asylum application. To be clear, if your child is 21 or over, or they're married, they can't get asylee status through your application. If they want to get asylum, they would need to submit their own application. in which they are the principal applicant. Before we move on to the next section, let me just note that your spouse and children can file their own asylum applications if they want to, even if they're eligible to be included as a dependent in your claim. It's perfectly acceptable for multiple people in a family to pursue their own asylum applications, even while being a dependent in another person's asylum case. They would need to qualify for asylum on their own merits, which may be hard in cases where the harm and threats are really just directed at one family member. Whether it makes sense to have multiple family members apply as principal applicants can be a tricky question, strategically speaking. It's something you should really discuss with an asylum lawyer. All right, with that, we've completed Part A2 and are ready to jump down to page 4, where we're going to start Part A3, which is titled Information About Your Background. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, this part is kind of tedious. It won't take us too long to get through it in this training video, but it will be a pain for you to actually find and supply all the information solicited, because you're being asked for quite a few details about things you probably haven't thought about in a long time. It's important, though, to be thorough and do this right. If you don't provide this information now, in your application, the asylum officer or judge may ask you to provide it at your asylum interview or hearing, and that process can take well over an hour. It really annoys the officer or judge. That's not how you want to get your case started, okay? So let's begin with number 1. The instruction says, list your last address where you lived before coming to the United States. If this is not the country where you fear persecution, also list the last address in the country where you fear persecution. Then, in parenthesis, it says, list address, city, town, department, province, or state and country. All right, this is asking us to list the last place you lived before coming to the United States. So you're going to list that place whether that was your home country or not. The question becomes, what does it mean to live somewhere? Like, if you left your home country and then spent a while in transit to the United States and perhaps stayed in some city along the way for a few weeks, would you need to list that city as the last place that you lived before coming to the United States? Or what if instead of a few weeks, you stayed there a few months? Does that mean you lived there? Well, there's no hard and fast rule that says that if you stayed in a place a given amount of days, weeks, or months, then you're considered to have lived there. This is kind of subjective, or at least within reason. If you spent a year in a country, you definitely lived there for purposes of the asylum application form. I would say that as a general rule, if you spent more than 2 months in a single country after having left your own country, then you should probably indicate that you lived in that third country. So, what's the last country in which you spent at least 2 months prior to your most recent entry to the United States? Put that place here, at number 1. On the left-hand side, it says number and street. This box is where you'll put the name of the street on which you lived, and if there's a house or apartment number associated with it, put that too. You can render it in the way that it's normally written in your country. In the United States, we usually put the house number before the street name, but it's the opposite in many countries. Write it however it's written in your country. Some people simply don't have a house number and might not even live on a street with a name at all. That's fine. In that case, just put N/A in this box. Next, moving over to the right, you're asked to list the city or town for the address in question. Moving on, one space to the right, it says department, province, or state. Put here the larger administrative unit in which your city was located, assuming there is one. In the next space, put the name of the country. Okay, in the next 2 columns, you've got to list the month and year in which you started living at the address in question, and then, over on the far right, put the month and year that you stopped living at that address. Note that you're not being asked to list the actual calendar day that you started and stopped living at the address, just the month and year. All right, so you finished the information for the last address at which you lived before coming to the United States. But you might need to provide another address, which would go on the line immediately below what you just filled out. This is the case if your last address, the one we just talked about, was not for the country in which you fear being persecuted, that is, your home country. So if you left your home country and lived somewhere else before coming to the United States, you will be listing 2 addresses for number 1, the place you lived most recently before coming to the United States, along with your last address in your home country. The latter, your most recent address in your home country, should go on the second line for number 1. But if you didn't live in any other countries before coming to the United States, then you'll only be listing at number 1 your last address in your home country. If you jumped around in your own country before leaving for the United States, perhaps moving around to avoid being harmed, Then provide the last address at which you stayed for at least 2 months. And with that, we're done with number 1. And ready for number 2, which asks you to provide information about your residences during the past 5 years. It asks you to list your present address first, meaning they want you to go in reverse chronological order. You're asked for the same information in the same order as what was requested just above, for the address at which you lived before coming to the United States. They want first the number and street, then the city or town, and next the department, province, or state. One space over to the right, you'll list the country, and then, in the 2 columns on the right, the month and year that you started living at each address and the month and year in which you stopped living at the address. Now, note that the instruction says, list your present address first. So that's what you should do in this first line under number 2, even though you already provided your present address up on page 1. Since this is your present address, there's not actually an end date, right? You're still living there, so there's not a month and year in which you stopped living there. In the far right column, you could put the month and year in which you're submitting your asylum application. But I recommend that you instead the word present to signify that you're presently living there. Okay, now unless you've been living at your current address for 5 years, you'll need to drop down and list your prior address, the place you lived at immediately before moving to your current address. So, list all the required data for that address on the second line under number 2. After you've done that, ask yourself, is the month and year in which you started living at that address at least 5 years from the current date? For example, let's say you're going to submit your asylum application in October 2023, and you started living at the prior address in December 2018. Can you stop listing addresses? Well, no. You'll need to continue, because December 2018 is less than 5 years from October 2023. You would be 2 months shy of 5 years. So, you would need to go down to the third line and add yet another address. Why? Because you've got to show addresses for at least the last 5 years. So, you would add your prior address on the third line and then do the same assessment. See whether the month and year of the starting time is at least 5 years prior to the current month and year. If it is, then you're done with addresses. You don't need to add any more. If you're still not to 5 years, then keep listing your previous addresses until you get there. Once you get to 5 years, you're done. No need to keep listing prior addresses. Before moving on, let me address a common scenario that people often ask about. Is it okay to have gaps in your address history? Like, what if you stopped living somewhere and then traveled for 3 months through multiple countries to get to the United States, but never stayed for more than a couple weeks in a single place while in transit? Would it be okay to show a 3-month gap between your last address in your home country and your first address in the United States? Yes, I think that's fine. Not a problem. All right, now we're ready for number 3. The instruction here is, provide the following information about your education, beginning with the most recent school that you attended. This one, my friends, is frustrating. You see, you're expected to list all educational institutions you've attended during your entire life, and it can be hard to track down the information solicited for each of these educational institutions. You've got to provide, in order from left to right, the name of the school, the type of school, its location, the month and year in which you started attending the school, and the month and year in which you stopped attending it. For people with an extensive educational background, this can take a while. Now, I've referred to educational institutions, and the form itself uses the word school, but it might still not be entirely clear what kind of education you're supposed to include here. For example, does a 3-month online course you took to learn how to code and which didn't lead to any kind of degree or formal certification count? Would you need to list that here? No, I don't think you do. I think you only need to include formal education at institutions that grant degrees, or at least are part of the normal path toward eventually getting a degree. But you definitely should include your time at an institution, even if you didn't end up graduating from it. Like, if you went to college for a year but then stopped, you should list this, even though you didn't finish the program. Okay, so you're going to start on the first line with the most recent educational institution you attended. Type the name of the school in the first box. For the next space in the type of school column, try to indicate what kind of school it was. I recommend indicators like graduate school or university for higher education. For education before that, things like secondary school and primary school are good classifications for this column. And to be clear, yes, you should list even your primary school or schools. Is this likely relevant to your asylum claim? No, absolutely not. And it is, in my opinion, ridiculous that you're asked to provide this information, but you are. So you should find and include this information, okay? Here's the thing. To be honest, most immigration judges don't care whether you've listed all your educational history, but most asylum officers at USCIS do care. They're taught that this information needs to be complete and accurate in the application form. And if you don't do this when you submit your application, they'll have to go over it with you on the day of your interview and will try to drag out of you all this information so they can add it into your application. And that process is painful. It can take a long time. This is very frustrating for the asylum officer. Having to deal with this at the asylum interview starts the whole thing off on the wrong foot. It's not how you want to get one of the most important interactions of your life started, I assure you. So go through the effort to pin down this information ahead of time and include it in your asylum application when you apply, okay? All right, moving along. We're ready for the location column. It says address next to the word location, as if you need to list the actual address of the school. But to be honest, I've never seen an asylum officer or immigration judge request the address. They're fine, in practice, with just the city and country. So, list the city in which the institution is located, followed by a comma, and then the name of the country. Next, list the beginning and ending month and year of your attendance. You may well need to use the continuation page. Your educational history might not fit on the 4 lines provided for this question. If that's the case, jump down to page 12. That's the Supplement B page, which is a continuation page on which you can provide information that wouldn't fit up above where it was meant to go. Remember how earlier we saw that on page 12 it asked you to list the part and the question number you're addressing? Well, if you've already put something in those blanks, because you've already used this continuation page for something, then what should you do now, when you're ready to add information related to a new part and a new questions? Well, I would just insert your cursor down below whatever text you previously entered in the main body on this page, and then type out the word part, and follow that with whatever part you're now addressing. So if we're adding information about your educational history, we would put here A3, because that's the part dealing with this topic. It's probably best to use Roman numerals to identify the part, since that's what the asylum application form itself uses. But it's fine to just use the digit. Then, drop down a line and write question, followed by the number of the question at issue. For educational history, that's number 3. Next, go down a couple lines and provide the same information that you provided up on page 4 regarding each educational institution. Okay, with that, we're back on page 4 and ready to move on to number 4. The instruction says, provide the following information about your employment during the past 5 years. List your present employment first. All right, we're going to do basically the same thing we just finished doing for education, but this time for your jobs. You've got to list every job you've had for the last 5 years in reverse chronological order. The specific information required, from left to right, is name and address of employer, then your occupation, followed by the month and year in which you began that employment, and the month and year in which you stopped doing the job. So, first, starting with your current job, or if you're not presently employed, your most recent job. State the name of your employer. For example, if you work at Walmart, you'd type Walmart, followed by a semicolon before you go on to list the address. I recognize that there are different kinds of employment arrangements. Yours might not be as straightforward as a scenario in which someone works for an established employer. For example, what about self-employment? Well, if you actually have an established company that you do the work through, list the name of that company. But if you're doing work outside the context of an established business structure, whether that's doing work to fix things in people's houses, babysitting, mowing lawns, or really anything at all, then you can just put self-employed here for the name of your employer. And then, remember, we've got to put the address of your employer. As with the location of the schools you attended, I actually do not think it's necessary to put the full address here. Instead, I think it's fine to list just the city in which the work is performed, followed by a comma. Then, after a space, list the U.S. state if the employment you're referencing is in the United States. If it's abroad, list the name of the country. Okay, the next column asks for your occupation. What does that mean? You can think of it as your job title or role or profession. For example, this could be something like software engineer or sales clerk or construction worker or really anything that captures the essence of what it was that you were doing at that job. If you had a formal title or role, use that. If you didn't, just use a word or two to try to give the asylum officer or judge an idea of the main thrust of your work. Then, moving to the right, indicate the month and year you started working there, and the month and year you stopped working there. If you're presently working, then type the word present in the far right column. As we did with your residences, we've got to list all of your employment going back 5 years. So just keep adding jobs until you have stretched back 5 years. There are only 3 lines for your jobs on page 4. It's very common to have to use the continuation page at page 12 of the asylum application form to include your work history for the last 5 years. Note that you do need to list every job you've had during this time frame, even if some of them overlapped, and even if you didn't have permission to work legally. It's understandable that people would be uncomfortable listing work done in the United States without permission, but I do recommend that you list it here. I'll say it again. I believe that honesty is the best policy. It's also the smart thing to do in terms of trying to achieve your immigration goals. It's true that unauthorized employment can have negative consequences in immigration matters. The good news, though, is that it won't keep you from winning asylum. There's no rule that says you can't win asylum with unauthorized employment in your history, and it's likewise not even a formal factor in the analysis of your asylum eligibility. And I can tell you that I've never known a judge or asylum officer to even let this fact negatively impact their decision on an asylum case at all. When I was an asylum officer with the government, it was pretty much expected that asylum applicants had worked without permission. And there was really no problem with this. It was a non-issue. So, yes, I do recommend that you be open and honest about your employment history. You should list all employment during the last 5 years, even if you weren't authorized to work. All right, now we're ready to continue. We're at number 5, which says, provide the following information about your parents and siblings, and then in parenthesis, brother and sisters. It then says, check the box if the person is deceased. The 3 columns from left to right say full name, city/town, and country of birth, and then current location. The top line has the word mother, indicating that this line is for information about your mother. So, in the first space, state your mother's full name. In the next column, state the city in which your mother was born, followed by a comma. And then after one space, list the name of the country in which that city is located. In the far right column, we're providing the current location for each person. I think it's fine to put here the city and country in which they live. You don't need to list the whole address. If a parent or sibling has passed away, then instead of listing a city and country in this column, check the box to the left of the word deceased to indicate that they are no longer alive. By the way, if you don't know the information requested for a given parent or sibling and can't quickly get it, then it's okay to put the word unknown. A couple more notes. I think you should list your biological mother and father here, even if you don't know one or both of them, and even if you were adopted or raised by someone else whom you consider to be your parent. I do recommend that you list half-siblings, which is a sibling who shares one, but not both, of the same parents with you. I do not, however, think it's necessary to list step-siblings, which is someone who became part of your family through the marriage of one of their parents to one of your parents. Finally, note that there are only 4 lines here for your siblings. If you have more than that, you'll need to use the continuation page at page 12 of the application form to ensure you list all your siblings. All right, we're done with the family members. Let's continue. We're ready for Part B, titled Information About Your Application, which begins at page 5 of Form I-589. This is the substantive part of the asylum application. It's where we're explaining what has happened and why you're afraid to go back to your country. Before we dive in, let me say a few words about my philosophy for how this should be approached. I think you should provide enough detail in response to the substantive questions to let the decision maker, the asylum officer or immigration judge, understand what your case is about. But you do not need to be hyper-detailed. You need to be responsive to the questions being asked. You need to give answers that address the questions, but I do not think you need to provide every little detail that the instructions ask for. You definitely should not just write "see attachment" or "see my statement" in response to the questions, referencing the personal statement that you may include with your application materials. Lots of people do this, but you should not. It's annoying for the judge or asylum officer. They need to be able to understand what your case is about by quickly scanning your answers to the substantive questions. It also just looks like you're lazy when you do that. So we do want to actually address the question being asked, but we're not going to go into great detail here. You will go into detail in the personal statement, sometimes called a declaration, that I recommend you do for your case. But that's different from the actual asylum application form. I think you'll get a sense for what level of detail is advisable for the asylum application form as we work our way through the questions. So, what do the instructions ask for? They say this. When answering the following questions about your asylum claim, you must provide a detailed and specific account of the basis of your claim to asylum or other protection. To the best of your ability, provide specific dates, places, and descriptions about each event or action described. Okay, are we going to do that? Kind of. Stay with me. You'll see what I mean in a minute when I give some examples. But first, let's see what the next part of the instructions say. You must attach documents evidencing the general conditions in the country from which you are seeking asylum or other protection and the specific facts on which you are relying to support your claim. If this documentation is unavailable or you are not providing this documentation with your application, explain why in your responses to the following questions. So they're saying here that you should attach to your application two different types of documents. One is what's called country conditions information, and the other is evidence that's specific to your individual claim. Country conditions information refers to things like reports from governments, non-governmental organizations, and news agencies about things that are happening in your country that are relevant to your asylum claim. And when I say evidence specific to your individual claim, I mean documents that directly back up things that you are claiming have happened to you, or that support the proposition that you're at risk in your country, or that help show the motivations of the people you fear. This could be things like medical records from a doctor's visit after you were attacked, or perhaps screenshots of threatening WhatsApp messages. So, the instructions are saying to attach this stuff to your application. Should you do so? Well, honestly, I don't think that's necessary at the application stage. You can submit these documents later. Most people want to apply for asylum as soon as possible, because the sooner you apply for asylum, the sooner you're eligible to get a work permit, right? Finding and compiling all this supplemental information, the documentation discussed in the instruction I just read, takes time, especially if you want to do it well, which I think you should. And really, I've never known an asylum officer or immigration judge to take issue with a case just because the applicant didn't provide this kind of supporting documentation at the time of application. And I likewise am not aware of applications being flat out rejected for lack of this documentation being attached. So yes, what I'm saying is that I think you can ignore this instruction for now, okay? Yes, even the part that says, if this documentation is unavailable or you're not providing this documentation with your application, explain why in your responses to the following questions. I don't think you need to do that. All right, we're ready to address the first questions in this section. Number 1 says, why are you applying for asylum? And then it tells you to check the appropriate boxes below and then provide detailed answers to questions A and B below. Then, just below that instruction, it says, I am seeking asylum or withholding of removal based on, and then there are 6 different items, like 6 menu options, and you're supposed to put a check mark in the box that's next to any of the options that apply in your case. In other words, you're supposed to indicate what your basis for seeking asylum is. You see, to get asylum, it's not enough to show that you've been persecuted or that you're likely to be persecuted in the future. You've also got to convince the asylum officer or immigration judge that this persecution is motivated by one of 5 specific things. What matters here is the persecutor's perspective. What is it in their mind about you that they don't like and which causes them to want to harm you? You see, you've got to demonstrate that it's one of the so-called 5 protected characteristics that you possess, or that the persecutors at least believe you possess, that's motivating the persecution, or at least playing a significant role in motivating it. And these 5 protected characteristics, which are sometimes called the 5 protected grounds, are your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and something called membership in a particular social group. Now, each of these has a specific meaning, but there is some flexibility and room for creativity in arguing that the thing that's motivating the persecutor in your case falls within one of those categories. Let me say a few words about each of them, starting with race. This can be something like someone being targeted because of the color of their skin. You know, racism. And what about religion? Well, persecution on account of that protected ground is most often pretty straightforward. It's often adherents of one religion harming people from another religion just because of their differing religious views. But persecution by people within the same religion occurs too, like within Islam between Sunnis and Shias, or within Christianity between Protestants and Catholics. Also, note that persecution because someone is an atheist counts as persecution on account of their religion for asylum purposes. Yes, even though the person doesn't actually have a religion, persecution of them because they're atheist would count as religious persecution. All right, we covered race and religion. What about nationality? It's usually straightforward. If someone persecutes you because you're from a certain country, this would be persecution on account of nationality. We often see persecution on account of nationality in cases where immigrants are targeted by nationalist extremists, there can be overlap between race and nationality. For example, Jews are considered to be a racial group, and they were also viewed in the Soviet Union as a nationality. It was listed as a nationality on their passports. Okay, so what about membership in a particular social group? That's an odd name, right? This one is actually pretty flexible. There's some room for creativity in arguing that a person is, in fact, part of a particular social group, and then that this membership is what's motivating the persecution. What are examples of qualifying particular social groups? Well, being a member of the LGBTQ community, having suffered female genital mutilation, or having suffered domestic violence can fit under this category. Likewise, if someone harms you as a means to punish or harm one of your family members, like your spouse, child, or parents, then you may be able to satisfy the protected ground element, as persecution that's motivated by this is considered to be on account of your membership in a particular social group. If the persecutor's ultimate goal is to harm one of your immediate family members, and they know they can do that by persecuting you, then this would be persecution on account of a protected ground. Okay, last protected ground, political opinion. This one is pretty broad. It covers a scenario where the government or supporters of one political party persecute people from the rival party, just because of those political differences. But it covers quite a few other things that might not seem to be political in nature. For example, the following may fall within this political opinion protected ground: being a feminist, exposing government corruption, participating in student groups, exposing human rights abuses by the government, participation in community organizations, and even opposition to gangs, drug cartels, or other powerful non-state entities like tribes. All right, so those are the 5 protected grounds: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, and political opinion. You should know that one of these grounds may be implicated, and thus may help you in your asylum case, even if it might not seem that way at first blush. Some of these can be a little complicated. Persecution that might not seem like it's motivated by one of the 5 protected grounds might, in reality, fall under one of these categories. Note that the protected ground doesn't have to be the only reason for the persecution. It just has to be a significant factor in motivating the persecution. Note, too, that persecution that's originally motivated by something having nothing to do with a protected ground could turn into persecution on account of a protected ground. Finally, let me emphasize that you can get asylum when the persecution is motivated by a protected ground that the persecutors have or will impute to you. What does that mean? Well, it means that you might not actually possess the protected ground, but the persecutors think you possess it, and that's what motivates them to harm you. For example, they may think you're a member of a racial minority that they like to target for harm. You're not, but they attack you anyway because they're simply mistaken. This would be persecution on account of race, with the possession of the protected ground, race, imputed to you by the persecutors. Okay, so then your task in addressing this question is to check the box next to any of the protected grounds that you think apply in your case. Ask yourself, what words have the persecutors used and what circumstances exist that point to motive? Which of these 5 protected characteristics are putting you at risk? Check the box next to all that you think apply. And note that it's best to be over-inclusive and check a box where you think it might be appropriate but you're not positive. I'm not saying to check the box for one of these if there's absolutely no basis to argue that it's a motivating factor in your persecution. Rather, if you're not sure, then err on the side of caution and go ahead and check the box. All right, I've said several times that there are 5 protected grounds. Yet there are 6 options here that you can select. What's up with that? Well, the one in the lower right side, torture convention, is honestly just out of place. It makes no sense to have it here. The other 5 options are protected grounds under U.S. asylum law, as where the torture convention is not. And we already saw that at the very beginning of this form, there was an option to check a box to say that you want to apply for protection under the UN Convention Against Torture, which is the same thing that they're referring to here with the phrase torture convention. So it makes no sense to have it again here, in this section about motive, which by the way is called nexus in asylum law speak. In any event, I recommend that you do go ahead and check this box for torture convention. And with that, we're done with number 1 and ready to move on. We're not yet on number 2, but rather on a subpart of number 1. We're at 1A. This question asks, have you, your family, or close friends or colleagues ever experienced harm or mistreatment or threats in the past by anyone? There are then additional instructions if you answer yes to that question, which we'll address in a second. But first, let's talk about what this question is really getting at. This is all about past harm and whether that harm is sufficiently severe to rise to the level of persecution. You see, the immigration judge or asylum officer has three main decisions to make: whether you suffered past persecution, whether you're likely to suffer future persecution, and whether any such persecution is motivated by one of the 5 protected grounds under U.S. asylum law. We finished a minute ago talking about the 5 protected grounds, and we're going to see a question in a minute about future persecution. The question we're addressing now, at 1A, is focused on past persecution. The crucial question is whether the harm you've endured is so bad that it counts as persecution, as that term, persecution, is used in our asylum law. The thing is, it's not actually defined in the law or implementing regulations, so it's kind of subjective. There's a lot of gray area in terms of deciding whether the harm at issue is so bad that it counts as persecution. So we want to keep this in mind in answering this question. We want to highlight anything that's happened that shows that what you've endured is really serious, that the harm was very severe. Before we address the additional instructions for this question, let me touch on who this is asking about. The question asks about harm, mistreatment, or threats for you, your family, or close friends or colleagues. Now, why are they asking about your family, friends, and colleagues? 3 reasons. First, in rare circumstances, harm to them can count as harm against you in assessing whether what you endured is sufficiently severe to count as persecution. For example, if someone tortures your family member in front of you because they know it'll greatly distress you, that harm to you, the psychological harm of seeing this, is relevant and will be considered in the persecution analysis. The other reasons are that harm to people other than you may indicate that you're likely to be harmed in the future, and that it may tell us something about the persecutor's motives. That is, whether the persecution against you is on account of a protected ground. So in answering this question, you do want to address harm suffered not just by you, but also by family or others close to you. The overwhelming focus should be on you personally, but do try to summarize, if only in a couple sentences, what has happened to those close to you. Okay, so we're focusing on harm, mistreatment, or threats. But the instructions give us some additional parameters. The form says that we need to explain 1. What happened, 2. When it occurred, 3. Who did it, and 4. Why you believe the harm or mistreatment or threats occurred. Of those 4 elements, the only one that really needs explanation is the 4th, as it's a little ambiguous in my opinion. It's not asking what facts you can point to that show that the bad thing in fact occurred. It's not asking you to prove that it occurred. Rather, it's asking about motive. It's asking you to explain what you think it is that motivated the harm, mistreatment, or threats. I'm going to give you an example in just a second of what an answer to this question might look like, but first let me provide some general guidance. I recommend that you limit your answer to this little box. I think it's best not to use a continuation page for answering these substantive questions in the asylum application form. The decision maker wants to be able to quickly go through your application and get an understanding of the basics of your case. It's simply annoying to have to flip back to a continuation page and keep reading a long answer. So, you've got to be concise. You can't fit a whole lot of text in these boxes, but that's okay. It's actually a good forcing mechanism. It forces you to think hard about the strongest and most relevant aspects of your case, and to state them clearly and concisely. And you should really think hard about these substantive answers before settling on a final version. This is important stuff. Write out a draft answer on a Word document somewhere else, and then come back to it the next day with a fresh set of eyes to edit it, making it even better before you actually put the text in the asylum application form. Another important point: you don't have to list or discuss in this space every single incident of harm and all threats. If you've been through a lot, you simply won't have space for that here, and you moreover might not even be able to remember hardly any details for some of these things. That's okay. Your personal statement, the supplemental declaration that you'll either submit as part of your application filing or that you will send in later, is where you'll really go into detail about things, and where you'll try to address pretty much everything you can remember in terms of past harm or things that have happened that make you think you'll be harmed in the future. Think of this response that we're working on now, for question 1A, as an opportunity to flag some of the most egregious incidents of past harm, or some of the worst, scariest threats. If there are, let's say 3 things that have happened to you, then sure, you should be able to summarize each of them here, using 2 or 3 sentences to address each such incident. But if there are more, you won't have space for that. If there are instances of harm or threats that you are not going to explicitly discuss at this point in your application form, then I recommend that you include a line that says as much, a line that says effectively, "There's more than what I'm listing here." If you're in this situation, You could consider starting out your answer in this box with something like this. I have been harmed and threatened many times in my country. I am listing here a few of the incidents that had an especially strong impact on me. So by doing that, you're signaling that there's additional stuff, that you're including here only a few of many things that are relevant to your case. This way, you're foreclosing the ability of a judge or asylum officer to later say, "Oh, but why didn't you talk about X incident in your asylum application? That seems like an inconsistency. Do you see what I mean?" Great. The idea then is that you'll focus here on 2 or 3 of the most serious incidents. So let's go through an example of how someone could describe an incident of past harm in a way that addresses everything that the instructions say to address, okay? Now, remember, details that we're supposed to state include what happened, when it happened, who did it to you, and what facts are there that show their motive. That is, what can we point to that shows that the harm was motivated by the fact that you possess one of the 5 protected grounds? So here's an example of a good description of an incident. On May 10th, 2023, 2 men whom I did not know came up to me on the street. When they approached, one of them said he knew that I was one of those people who does not respect religion. Then the other man punched me in the stomach 2 times with his fist before they walked away. My stomach hurt for the next 2 days from the punches and it was bruised. Given their statement, I believe these men were religious extremists and that they harmed me because they thought I was insufficiently religious. Okay, see what I did? I hit all the elements that I've said you should include when describing an incident. We have the when. I put that right at the beginning, which I recommend that you do as well. The who is also in the first sentence. It's 2 men I did not recognize, who walked up to me and who, judging by their comments, seemed to be religious extremists. The what is captured in the information about what the bad guys said and what they actually did to harm me, particularly the 2 punches to the stomach. And I addressed the why did it happen part in my last sentence, where I said that in light of the bad guy's comments, it looks like this incident concerns religion. And note that I was sure to include what the bad guys said before they attacked me. This statement about people not respecting religion helps to show their motive. So that covers the stuff the instructions called for. But did you notice that I added something else? I included a couple sentences about the aftermath of the incident. I talked about the injuries I sustained. This is important. Why? Because it helps drive home how serious the harm was, which is relevant to establishing that the past harm was sufficiently severe to rise to the level of persecution. Granted, the harm in my example wasn't super grave, but still, it's a good idea to explain your injuries and what was required to treat them, especially if you had to seek professional medical treatment, or if you needed to seek the help of a mental health professional for psychological distress resulting from the bad things that happened to you. By the way, I listed a precise date in my example, which you should do only if you're positive about the date that something occurred. If you're not sure, don't just make something up. You can use words like approximately or around to signify that you're not positive, but you think something happened around a certain date. It's okay also to use just a month and year, omitting the actual date if you're not positive about that. If something happened when you were young and you're really not sure what year it was, you could say something like, when I was probably around 10 or 11 years old, and so on. All right, so in this space, go ahead and describe a few of the most significant incidents of harm or threats against you, focusing on details that show the decision maker just how bad it was and what it was that motivated it. If there are several things that you want to talk about, and there are also things that have happened to family or friends that could be included here too, you should prioritize the things directly concerning you. If there's not space to describe the things directly related to you and things that happen to others, just talk about the stuff specific to you, okay? Great. One last thing about how to approach this question concerning past incidents of harm or threats. If you're recounting what people said to you, and you can't remember everything or it was a lot, such that you don't have space to detail it all here, in this small space we've got to answer, then you should use some qualifying language to indicate that there's more to the story. In the example I gave a minute ago, I said that during the attack, one of the attackers said he knew that I was one of those people who does not respect religion. Recall that in my recounting of the incident, I didn't include anything else that the bad guys said, just that one line about people who don't respect religion. But what if the bad guys had said a bunch of other stuff? Like, what if it was a long encounter? And they said so much stuff that I couldn't really even remember all of it. That's totally reasonable, by the way. You're being asked to recall traumatic events, some of which happened a long time ago. It's okay that some things stand out to you. While you can't remember every little detail of how things happened, or exactly what was said, you can account for this in your asylum application form by saying something like, "They said several things to me during the attack. I don't remember all of them because everything happened so fast and it was a traumatic experience. But I do remember them saying, 'You're a filthy dog who does not know what it means to trust the true religion,' and telling me that I would have paid dearly for this transgression." Okay, see what I did there? I provided some more detail, but I made clear that this wasn't everything that they said. Another way to approach this would be to write something like, "They said a lot of things during this incident. Some of the things that really stood out to me were them calling me a traitor, scum, and loser, and saying that next time things would be much worse for me." All right, so in that rendering, I made clear that a bunch of things were said, and then I just listed some of the things that made the biggest impression. You would want to try to list the things that happened, or that were said that were the gravest or scariest, or that show that they plan to harm you in the future, or that demonstrate the reason they're targeting you for harm. By the way, in addition to answering in narrative form in the space provided, don't forget to check the little box to the left of the word "yes" up above, to signify that you have in fact had problems in the past. That is, of course, assuming that you have in fact been harmed, mistreated, or subjected to threats in your country. If you have not, then of course check the box for no. And don't worry, it may still be possible to win asylum even without any past harm or threats. I'll say more on that in a minute. Okay, I think you see now how this works. That's great. We're ready then to move on to question 1B. This is forward-looking, as where 1A was backward-looking. The question we just finished, 1A, was about past harm or other bad things, including threats, that happened in the past. But 1B is focused on whether you're likely to be harmed in the future in a way that's sufficiently severe to be considered persecution. And if so, whether that persecution would be motivated by one of the 5 protected grounds under U.S. asylum law. The question here is, do you fear harm or mistreatment if you return to your country? And then there are subparts that tell you that if your answer to the question is yes, then you need to explain 1. What it is that you fear will happen, 2. Who you believe will harm you, and 3. Why you believe you could be harmed or mistreated. For this last element, quote, why you believe you could be harmed or mistreated, it's not clear whether they're asking what basis you have to believe that you're in danger, or instead, what would motivate the feared harm. I recommend that you address both of those issues in your answer. Okay, the main thing we're trying to do here is show the asylum officer or immigration judge that you're at risk of being persecuted on account of a protected characteristic. We'll use this space to point out whatever threats or circumstances exist that indicate that you're in danger, and that show that the bad guys will want to harm you because of one or more of the 5 protected grounds. To do this, I recommend starting with a sentence that hits all 3 of the things that you're asked to address, and then going back and providing support for this proposition. So again, we're supposed to state what harm we fear, who it is that'll do it, and their motive for doing so, along with anything that supports our contentions in this regard. Therefore, the first sentence could look something like this. I fear the government's secret police will unlawfully imprison me long-term, torture me in prison, and even kill me over my political opinion and activities, in support of the political opposition in my country. See how that single sentence addresses subparts 1 through 3? The what is imprisonment, torture, or death. The who is the secret police. And the why is the person's political opinion, as demonstrated through their political activities. After that sentence, I would go on to reference any past incidents of harm or threats, as those can help show both that the bad guys are inclined to harm you in the future, and that the feared persecution will be on account of a protected characteristic. For example, you could say, the secret police have unjustly detained me on 3 occasions, holding me overnight on 2 of them. One of the detentions lasted around a month. During all 3 detentions, officers struck me repeatedly with wooden batons all over my body, including in the head. During various of the attacks, they called me a traitor and said I had sold out the motherland by undermining the president. During the last detention, they said it was my last warning, and that if I talked bad about the ruling party again, they would finish me off. After I left my country, I began criticizing the president and his party on social media platforms and in a podcast interview that is popular in my country. All right, so with this example, we would have provided more detail on the 3 detentions up above in response to question 1A, and then here in 1B, we're just referencing the incidents briefly because they help support the assertion that the government will still want to harm us. I want to draw your attention to the last sentence in my example, where I talk about criticizing the government on social media after having left my home country. This is an important detail, as it gives my home government yet another reason to want to hurt me. I've defied them by continuing to act against the government, such that they're now likely to make good on their threats of doing even worse things to me. This is important. You want to include in this part, question 1b, anything that either shows that the bad guys are interested in harming you going forward, or that could motivate them to do so if they found out about it. The social media thing is a common example. Lots of people start or continue criticizing their government once in the United States, which may incentive that government all the more to harm them. The immigration judge or asylum officer needs to know about things like this, circumstances that show that you're at risk and will remain at risk. Let me now address a different kind of case, one where you've never been harmed or threatened in the past, but you're all the same afraid of being harmed in the future. This, question 1b, is where you explain what's going on or what it is about you that makes you afraid. For example, once they're already in the United States, a person may convert to a new religion, putting them in danger because people who do that get persecuted back in their home country. Or a person who hid their sexuality may come out as a member of the LGBTQ community once in the United States, and just living openly could put them at risk in their country. In both of those situations, the person probably wouldn't have endured past threats or harm, right? But they're now in danger in their home country because something has changed. So in this box, you wouldn't be talking about stuff from your past that shows you're at risk going forward, but rather would explain what it is that has changed or what it is about you now that puts you at risk in your country. For example, a religious convert could recite a very short summary of their faith journey, explaining that they became a member of the new religion on X date and detailing some of the activities they do in furtherance of their new faith. They would then explain that they are afraid because people who have converted away from the dominant faith in their country get persecuted by the government. If you know personally anyone to whom this has happened, you can describe that in just a couple or few sentences. Or if there's a particularly high-profile case of it happening, like something you saw in the news, then you could mention it here, noting that learning about it really caused you to be afraid, assuming that's true, of course. Don't worry, you can definitely win asylum even without any past incidents of harm or threats. It's true that it may be harder, depending on the particular circumstances of your case, but it's not impossible. This is where country conditions information is especially important. Okay, so now, having finished 1b, we're ready for number 2 of part B, which is at the top of page 6 of the application. Congratulations, you're making great progress. All right, number 2 asks, have you or your family members ever been accused, charged, arrested, detained, interrogated, convicted, and sentenced, or imprisoned in any country other than the United States? And then in parenthesis says, including for an immigration law violation? Let me start by drawing your attention to the geographic limitation in this question. It's asking about countries other than the United States. So if you've ever had any kind of legal problems in the United States, this question, number 2, is not where you need to address them. Rather, for this question, we're only concerned about legal problems in other countries. Now, let me be clear that this is asking about all countries other than the United States. Sometimes people who have gotten into trouble in a country other than their own, but which is also not the United States, will answer no to this question when they should in fact mark the box for yes. So remember, it's asking about legal problems anywhere outside of the United States, including your home country and all other countries except for the United States. Next, we need to get a sense for what kind of stuff you have to mark yes for. Again, the different kinds of legal problems that they're asking about for you or family members include being charged, arrested, detained, interrogated, convicted and sentenced, imprisoned, or accused. The word accused appears at the beginning of the list in the question on the asylum application form, but I chose to move it to the end in restating the list just now, to draw your attention to it. Why? Because this one often gets overlooked. Sure, a person knows if they've been formally convicted of a crime, and they're unlikely to forget it or otherwise omit it from this form, assuming they read this question even halfway carefully. But the accusation thing is a bit more vague. What does it mean to be accused, exactly? Well, the instructions don't make that clear, but I suggest that you err on the side of caution and answer yes, if any government official has ever told you that they believe you committed a crime. For example, if someone from the prosecution service walked up to you and said, "We've had you under investigation for treason, and we plan to bring charges against you imminently," then this would be an accusation, even if they never actually bring charges against you. What about just being called a traitor by a police officer at a protest? Would that be an accusation of a crime, like treason? Well, no, I don't think so. I don't think you'd need to answer yes to this question because of that. Also, if the people who detain, interrogate, or accuse you are not government actors, then I likewise think you can answer no to this question. I think it's really interested in official government actors, not civilians. What about legal problems for small things, like a traffic ticket? Do you need to answer yes here for a citation for a traffic violation, like when you get a ticket for speeding? No, I don't think you do. A simple speeding issue probably doesn't lead to a conviction or formal charges or anything like that. It's arguably a detention when a police officer pulls you over for speeding, but I still just don't think that a traffic ticket is the kind of thing that this question is meant to cover. Okay, let me draw your attention to this instruction, just below the no and yes boxes that says, if yes, explain the circumstances and reasons for the action. So if you answered yes, you've got to use this space to explain what happened. It asks for the circumstances and reasons for the arrest, detention, charges, or whatever the case may be. I don't think you need to go into great detail here. I think you can probably sum it up in a few sentences. Here's an example. In July 2018, the police in my country arrested me as I was leaving a meeting of my political party and held me in jail for 3 nights. I was not charged with a crime and did not in fact commit one. This action against me was illegitimate and motivated by my political activities. Okay, last thing for this question. If you have had problems with the authorities in any country, including the United States, you're supposed to provide records for it. Ideally certified copies of any arrest reports, as well as of documents from any court proceedings that show what you were charged with and what ended up happening in the case, how it ended, like whether you were convicted, and if so, what punishment you received. It may be impossible to get these documents from a foreign government. That's okay. But if you've had legal trouble in the United States, a topic we'll address in a minute, then you should be able to get these documents, and you definitely need to do so. You don't necessarily need to submit these documents with your asylum application. You can submit them later. If you have to answer yes to this question for something related, not to yourself, but to a family member, then you do not need to provide documentation regarding the incident. You just need to do that for yourself. By the way, this question refers to your family members, without telling you which family members in particular they want to know about. So how far out in your family tree do you have to go? Well, I don't think you need to worry about distant family. In fact, I would only include here your parents, siblings, spouse, and children if they've had problems with the law. This same guidance regarding which family members to include in your answers goes for the next 2 questions in Part B, by the way, questions 3A and 3B. Okay, let's go to 3A. This is kind of a long question. Here's what it asks. Have you or your family members ever belonged to or been associated with any organizations or groups in your home country, such as, but not limited to, a political party, student group, labor union, religious organization, military or paramilitary group, civil patrol, guerrilla organization, ethnic group, human rights group, or the press or media? So, what's the purpose of this question? What are they getting at? Well, they want to know about your activities with these groups because they could form the basis for an asylum claim. The harm you've suffered or that you may endure in the future could, if it's motivated by your activity in certain groups, be considered to be on account of a protected ground. It's important that you get this one right. If your claim is based on religious persecution, and you talk at your asylum interview about being involved in your church, but you neglected to list your church affiliation in response to this question, well, that's a problem. This question explicitly lists religious organization as one of the types of groups that you need to list if you're involved with it. Affiliation with certain organizations may also serve as a red flag for immigration officials. See how they list in the question military or paramilitary group, civil patrol, and guerrilla organization. While association with those groups may help you establish nexus to a protected characteristic, it may also lead to questions about whether you could be barred from asylum for having persecuted other people. For example, if you say that you were in the military in your country, and the military was known to have committed grave human rights abuses while you were a member, you can expect questions about whether you were involved in such activity. Does the fact that answering a question truthfully might lead to hard questions mean that you should lie? Or perhaps omit potentially damaging information? Absolutely not. Please be open, honest, and forthcoming. Now, what kind of groups should you be including beyond those specifically listed in the question? Like, how do you know whether you need to list here some other organization that you've been associated with? That's not an easy question to answer. I can tell you that you don't need to list every single entity that you've ever been in some way affiliated with. For example, you do not need to include the chess club or sports teams you were on at your secondary school, or the group piano lessons you did, or the short-lived running club that you and your friends had when you promised you were going to get into better shape. But if the group has or had a more formal nature, you should list it. Also, if your membership in a group or activities with it are directly related to your asylum claim, then you should list it here. For example, if you were part of a community committee that tried to persuade youths not to join gangs, and the gangs are mad at you and threatening you over these efforts, then you should list that committee here, assuming it has a name. All right, let me draw your attention to an important part of these instructions. It says you should answer yes, and list out in the blank space any groups or organizations that you have, quote, ever belonged to or been associated with. The ever been associated with part makes this really broad. If you've ever been involved with a group, you should include it here even if you weren't formally a member. We see this a lot with political parties. Sometimes a person will support a particular political party, go to their meetings, attend protests with them, and maybe do other things with or in support of the party, but they never formally became a member. In such a case, the person should answer yes and list their party here. Last note on this instruction we've been discussing. It is limited to your home country. It's only asking about groups in your country, so you don't need to account for groups with which you've been involved in other countries. Okay, so if you've ever belonged to or been associated with a group or organization in your home country, you're going to put a check in the box next to the word yes. If you do that, then you've got more to do. You see, there's an additional instruction for everyone except those who indicate that they've never been involved in any groups or organizations. The instructions say that if you marked yes, then you must describe for each person the level of participation, any leadership or other positions held, and the length of time you or your family members were involved in each organization or activity. That's a lot, so how should you address this? I recommend that you do this in narrative form, meaning we're going to write sentences rather than just making a list. For example, someone involved in a political party could say, quote, I joined the opposition political party Freedom for All in March 2015 and was an active participant until I left my country in December 2022. From June 2000 to June 2021, I held the position of Regional Elections Coordinator, in which capacity I oversaw all campaigns by my party's candidates for office at the state and federal levels in my state and 2 surrounding states. Now, from the instructions on what information to provide, the only thing we didn't really address so thoroughly was the part that says to describe your level of participation. I think that's a really vague instruction, and I've never known an immigration judge or asylum officer to take issue with an answer here that doesn't address it, so I'm inclined to ignore it. Honestly, I don't think you need to worry about being super detailed for this question. Just note the organization. Try to give an estimate for the time frame of your involvement and highlight any leadership or formal roles or positions you held. If it's an organization or role that's central to your asylum claim, you'll provide much more detail in the personal statement that you will eventually submit for your case. Okay, you get the point on this one, so let's move on. We're ready for 3B, which is asking about the same thing, involvement with groups or organizations, but with regard to the present. The question asks, quote, do you or your family members continue to participate in any way in these organizations or groups? If you answered no to 3A, then 3B doesn't apply to you, so you can just decline to check a box here and write N/A in the text field. But if you answered yes to 3A, then you'll need to check the appropriate box here for 3B, depending on whether you or the family members you talked about above are still in fact involved in the groups you listed at 3A. If you or your family members are still involved, then check the box for yes. And in the text field, you've got to, per the instructions, describe for each person your or your family member's current level of participation, any leadership or other positions currently held, and the length of time you or your family members have been involved in each organization or group. So basically, they're asking the same stuff they asked about the past, but now for the present. If you joined a group in your country and you never officially ceased being a member, but the nature of your participation has changed now that you're in the United States, you should mark the box for yes. In the text field, you could put something like, I am still a member of my political party, Freedom for All, but do not have a leadership position and do not regularly participate in the party's activities since I am abroad. However, I sometimes join party meetings by video conference and have met a couple times with party members here in the United States to explore the prospect of opening a party branch here. The point of that example is to show that you should give the decision maker a sense for the nature and extent of your current involvement with the groups you were involved with in your own country. Note that you do not need to discuss here any groups you've been involved with after leaving your country. This is because the question specifically asks about organizations that you were involved with in your own country. It's not asking about organizations anywhere else. All right, with that, we're ready to go to question number 4. It asks, are you afraid of being subjected to torture in your home country or any other country to which you may be returned? This sounds a lot like a previous question we encountered, number 1B up on page 5, which asked whether you fear harm or mistreatment if you return to your country. The main difference is that the previous question asked about being harmed or mistreated in the future, while this one, question 4, uses the word torture. Why are they asking you basically the same thing? Whether you fear bad things will happen to you in 2 different ways. Well, they probably could have accomplished the goal with a single question, but they wanted to address separately the issue of torture, as there's a form of relief available in immigration court to people who may be tortured in their country. We talked about this near the beginning of this training, when we discussed that bit at the very top of page 1, which said to check the box if you want to apply for withholding of removal under the Convention Against Torture. So, in number 4 on page 6, they're soliciting information to consider regarding your eligibility for this kind of protection. If you fear being harmed severely in the future in your country, you should check the box for yes. If you do that, the next step, per the instructions just below the yes and no options, is to, quote, explain why you are afraid and describe the nature of the torture you fear, by whom, and why it would be inflicted. I've got good news for you. You can just copy your answer from number 1B on page 5 and paste it in the blank space here at number 4 on page 6. If you fear being harmed very severely, and you did a good job answering the question about future harm and mistreatment, then you can just use that answer again here for the question about torture. One scenario where you would need to modify it is if the people you fear, the feared persecutors, are not government officials, but rather are private citizens. In that case, you may want to add a line or two explaining that the government would basically turn a blind eye to the torture that you fear, that the government would not step in to try to help you. This is because, to qualify for protection under the Convention Against Torture, you've got to show that the government is either the entity that's going to torture you, or that it would, quote, consent or acquiesce to private actors torturing you. This basically means that the government is either in cahoots with the bad guys or simply can't be bothered to even try to protect you. If that's the case, you should explain what it is that makes you think this. For example, depending on the circumstances of your particular case, something along these lines might be appropriate. I believe the government will not help me because I have already gone to them 3 times over the attacks and threats against me. And the police told me each time that I would have to fend for myself because they could not get involved in religious matters. It actually wouldn't hurt to include a line to this effect in the question from page 5 about harm or mistreatment if the people you fear are private actors. To win asylum under that circumstance, you have to show that the authorities are, quote, unable or unwilling to control the feared persecutors. So it's similar to what we just discussed for torture. But there's a lower threshold. It's easier to show that the government is unable or unwilling to control the persecutors than it is to show that it would consent or acquiesce to you being tortured. For that reason, I do think it's worth addressing this issue, the role of the state, in answering the torture question, while it's fine but not necessary to do so for the question above, regarding harm or mistreatment. Last thing on this question, I really can't imagine too many scenarios where you would want to check the box for no here. I mean, if you're convinced that the worst harm you'll suffer is harassment and economic deprivation, which can be severe enough to rise to the level of persecution, then I guess it would make sense to say that, no, you don't fear being tortured. But most people who have had any kind of problems in their country, or fear being harmed in the future, do in fact fear that the harm could end up being really bad, like death, or very severe beatings or other harm that would be sufficiently severe to constitute torture. You see, torture is harm that's even more severe than persecution. But if you fear at all that you could be killed or have something really, really bad happen to you, then you should check the box for yes here and explain yourself in the narrative section. All right, we've completed page 6 and part B and are ready for part C, which is titled Additional Information About Your Application. Just a few more substantive questions to go. We're at the top of page 7, addressing question number 1. It says, have you, your spouse, your children, your parents, or your siblings ever applied to the U.S. government for refugee status, asylum, or withholding of removal? They're asking whether you or the family members in the question have applied in the United States for asylum, or have applied while abroad to go to the United States as a refugee, such as through a United Nations resettlement program, or have asked in immigration court for withholding of removal. If the answer to that question is no, check that box and move along. If the answer is yes, then you're asked to provide a bunch of details. The instruction says you would need to state what decision the person got on their application. If you or they were granted asylum or another form of protection, you need to explain what happened to that status. Like, does the person still have it, or was it terminated, or did they perhaps go from being an asylee to being a lawful permanent resident? Next, the instructions say you need to, quote, indicate whether or not you were included in a parent or spouse's application, and if so, include your parent or spouse's A number in your response. Remember how we talked about possibly adding dependents in your application? Well, if you were a dependent in the application of your spouse or parent, you need to provide information about that here. The instructions go on to say that, quote, if you have been denied asylum by an immigration judge or the Board of Immigration Appeals, describe any changes in conditions in your country or your own personal circumstances since the date of the denial that may affect your eligibility for asylum. What is that all about? Well, a denial by an immigration judge or the Board of Immigration Appeals makes you ineligible to apply for asylum again, or at least on the same grounds. You can't just apply again just because you didn't like the decision you got and you want to try again. However, you can apply again if there's been a change of circumstances, such that you now, based on something new that's happened or some kind of change, may have a viable asylum case. If that's you, then you've got to explain here what has changed such that you believe you now qualify for asylum. All right, let me give an example of how this question can be answered by someone who has family members who have applied for asylum, since this is in fact very common. Quote, my mother has an asylum claim pending in immigration court, and my father is a dependent in my mother's claim. I am not a dependent in my mother's claim. My sister was granted asylum by USCIS in 2021 and adjusted status to that of a lawful permanent resident in 2023. Okay, so that's the level of detail that I think you should provide if you've got family members who have applied for asylum in the United States. Note that you do not need to include their names unless you were included as a dependent in the claim of your parent or spouse. In that case, you should also include their A number, but if you were not a dependent in their claim, you would not need to provide their A number. All right, with that, we're moving on to number 2A. That question says, quote, after leaving the country from which you are claiming asylum, did you or your spouse or children who are now in the United States travel through or reside in any other country before entering the United States? This one is important. What they're getting at here is something called firm resettlement, and it affects a lot of people. You see, U.S. asylum rules say that if you were physically present in a country after your last departure from your own country, and you had permanent residency there or an offer to get it, you can't get asylum in the United States. This is called the, quote, firm resettlement bar. The idea is that if you could have stayed permanently in some other country that you were in before you got to the United States, then you should have just done that. Why should the United States give you sanctuary when you already had it elsewhere, somewhere outside of the country where you fear being persecuted? And this bar does actually come into play often because lots of people went through or lived in another country after leaving their country and before making it to the United States, and they might have had permanent residence there. So that's what questions 2A and 2B are getting at. They're trying to see whether you may be barred from asylum because you were firmly resettled in a third country before you got here. It's a two-part analysis for assessing the firm resettlement bar. First, was the applicant physically present in a third country after their last departure from their own country? And if so, 2, did they have permanent residence or an offer to get it while they were in that country? Question 2A addresses the first part. They want to know if you were in another country after leaving your country and before coming to the United States. If not, check the box for no. If you were, check the box for yes. Note that really the only people who can say no here are people who are from Mexico or Canada, or who had a direct flight from their own country to the United States. If you crossed other countries by land to get to the United States, you need to check the box for yes here. Similarly, if you had a connecting flight in a third country, you should say yes. That's right, even if you didn't leave the airport and even if you never left the airplane, like if it just sat on the tarmac in the third country for a while, you should check the box for yes here at 2A. I know that sounds weird, but trust me, that's how this works. And note that this question is asking not just about you, but also about your spouse and any children who are now in the United States. If any of you were physically present in one or more third countries even for a second, then you should say yes here. All right. 2B concerns the next step in the firm resettlement analysis. Whether you had permanent residence or an offer to get it while you were in any countries other than the United States after your last departure from your own country. Here's what it says, quote, "Have you, your spouse, your children, or other family members, such as your parents or siblings, ever applied for or received any lawful status in any country other than the one from which you are now claiming asylum?" First off, note that it's broader than question 2A in that, in addition to asking about you, your spouse, and children, it's also asking about your parents and siblings. So keep that in mind. And again, the actual question here is whether you or any of those people have, quote, ever applied for or received any lawful status in any country other than the one from which you are now claiming asylum? Like, did any of you ever apply for permanent residency, citizenship, or long-term immigration status anywhere other than your country? If so, then check the box for yes here. But what about short-term immigration status? Like, what if you applied for and got a tourist visa to go on vacation somewhere? Do you need to answer yes here? Yes, actually, I think that you should do so when you, your spouse, or your children applied for or got a tourist visa, or really any other kind of immigration status. But I will say that, when it comes to your parents and siblings, I don't think it's necessary to answer yes for any short-term status they applied for or got. For parents and siblings, I would only answer yes if they applied for or received asylum, permanent residency, or citizenship in a third country. I just don't think that immigration judges and asylum officers care much about the tourist visa your sister secured to visit Spain, okay? But you and your spouse and children, yes, probably best to provide information about any and all forms of immigration status you have received, including that of a short-term visitor, like for tourist or business purposes. It's important to note that you'll need to answer yes for this question if you or your family members, including your parents or siblings, have dual citizenship. This is true even if you or they didn't affirmatively apply for it, but instead were born with it or perhaps acquired it by operation of law at some point. It's also true if you had that citizenship but lost or renounced it such that you no longer have it. And actually, you should still mark yes here if you had permanent residency somewhere but no longer have it. Why? Well, because the question isn't asking whether you currently have immigration status somewhere other than your home country, but rather whether you have ever, like at any time in your whole life, had it or even applied for it. And again, this question is meant to cover dual citizens. And it doesn't matter whether you've ever been to that other country of citizenship or what your ties to it are. If another country considers you to be a citizen, you need to answer yes here at question 2B. Why might dual citizenship matter in your U.S. asylum case? Well, unfortunately, depending on where you live, you may need to prove that you qualify for asylum with regard to every country of which you're a citizen rather than just one country. I know this sounds weird, but it's true. For example, if you were born and grew up in Venezuela, but you're a citizen of both Venezuela and Spain, then you would normally need to show that you meet all the requirements for asylum, not just for Venezuela, but also for Spain, even if you've never set foot in Spain. This presents a major obstacle for most dual citizens who likely haven't been persecuted in one of their countries of citizenship and probably don't have a well-founded fear of being persecuted there in the future. Notice how I indicated that it may depend on where you live? Well, due to the different ways in which the U.S. government and at least one federal court of appeals have interpreted the law, your case will be treated differently if you live in New York, Vermont, or Connecticut, as compared to anywhere else in the United States. If you live in one of those three states, you've just got to show asylum eligibility with regard to one country of which you're a citizen. If you live anywhere else in the United States, then you've got to show that you qualify for asylum with regard to every country of citizenship. All right, if you or family members have ever applied for or received immigration status in a country other than one from which you're seeking asylum, then you answer this question with a yes, right? Well, if you do that, then you've got to follow additional instructions. But it's not just question 2B regarding immigration status, it's also question 2A about physical presence in any third country after your last departure from your own country. If you answer yes to either of those questions, then you've got to explain more in narrative form in the box below. Specifically, the instructions here say that if you answered yes to either 2A or 2B, then you must provide for each person the following: the name of each country and the length of stay, the person's status while there, the reasons for leaving. whether or not the person is entitled to return for lawful residence purposes, and whether the person applied for refugee status or for asylum while there, and if not, why he or she did not do so. This is yet another instance of the asylum application form being poorly designed. Why? Because these instructions really only have to do with question 2A, relevant to firm resettlement, yet the instructions make it sound like you have to provide all of this information not just for 2A, but also for 2B, despite that the additional information being solicited really doesn't have anything to do with 2B. In any event, I don't think you need to worry too much about providing the exact information asked for in this instruction. Rather, if you answered yes to question 2A, regarding your presence in a third country after leaving your own country, then I recommend a response here that indicates where you were, approximately how long you were there, what your immigration status was, and whether you applied for or were offered permanent residency. It could look something like this. I traveled through Mexico on my way to the United States. I was in Mexico for about a week. I entered Mexico using my country's passport. A visa is not required for short-term stays by nationals of my country. I did not have permanent residency or any other long-term immigration status in Mexico and was not offered such status. If you just had a connecting flight, your answer could look something like this. I had a layover of just a few hours in Germany en route to the United States. I did not leave the airport. I did not have permanent residency or any other long-term immigration status in Germany and was not offered such status. Okay, did you notice that I didn't, in either of those examples, address all of the stuff that the instructions say we should address? I did not talk about the reasons for leaving, whether or not I am entitled to return for lawful residence purposes, and whether I applied for refugee status or for asylum while there, and if not, why not? Based on my experience, I just don't think it's necessary to fully address all of that. All right, what should you do if you did in fact have permanent residency in a third country in which you were physically present after your last departure from your home country? Well, if you left that country because you were in danger there or because life was extremely difficult, you should try to explain that in a couple sentences here, in the narrative response section. You'll need to go into much more detail in your personal statement and be ready to explain at your immigration court hearing or asylum interview, as you'll have to convince the decision maker that you qualify for an exception to the firm resettlement bar. Okay, last thing on this section. If you have ever had more than one citizenship, you should explain that here in just a sentence or two. But it's probably not worth going into detail about how you got that citizenship and about your ties to that country. All right, with that, we're ready for the last question on page 7, which is question number 3. This one asks, have you, your spouse, or your children ever ordered, incited, assisted, or otherwise participated in causing harm or suffering to any person because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or belief in a particular political opinion? Okay, let's unpack that. First, who is it asking about? This question concerns you, your spouse, and your children. It does not concern your parents, siblings, or anyone else. Second, what is it actually asking about? Well, this is getting at the so-called persecutor bar. You see, if you've persecuted someone else, you can't get asylum in the United States. If you, your spouse, or children have been in any way involved in harming someone else, and that harm was done because the victim or victims possessed one of the 5 protected asylum characteristics, then you would need to mark yes for this question, and then, down below, describe in detail each such incident, including your level of involvement. I hope you're not a persecutor, such that you can answer this question with a no. Okay, good news. We're ready for page 8, which is the last page on which there are substantive questions to answer. This means you're almost done. Let's power through and finish this off, shall we? Okay, at the top of page 8, we're on question number 4. It says, after you left the country where you were harmed or fear harm, did you return to that country? Why are they asking this? Well, if you had problems in your country, left your country, and then went back to your country, it could be taken as a sign that you don't really, in fact, fear being harmed there. The idea is, well, you left there, yet you chose to return, which must mean that you weren't really that scared of being harmed there, or else you wouldn't have gone back to your country. You weren't afraid of returning then, so why should we believe that you're really afraid of returning now? Now, returning to your country after having left it isn't technically a bar to asylum. It's not, in other words, a deal breaker. But if you have to answer yes here, you can expect questions about it during your asylum interview or court hearing. If you answer yes, then the instructions say you must, quote, describe in detail the circumstances of your visit. For example, the date of the trips, the purposes of the trips, and the length of time you remained in your country for the visit. This is yet another one of those where I don't think you necessarily need to strictly adhere to the instructions. You want to explain what compelled you to return and to highlight any precautions you took that helped you to be safe. Here's an example. I returned to my country once after fleeing. In February 2022, I went back there to visit my father, who was on his deathbed. I wanted to see him once more and say goodbye before he died. I was only in my country for about a week, and I kept a low profile. I only left my parents' house a couple times, and I did not tell anyone other than my immediate family members about my visit. With that explanation, we're showing that we had an urgent need to return. It wasn't just to hang out or because you were homesick. Also, explaining how you kept a low profile helps to beat back any contention by the asylum officer or judge that, well, the bad guys must not really want to harm you, or else they would have done so while you were there. All right, we're moving on to question number 5. This one concerns the 1-year filing deadline. This is very important. This deadline affects a lot of people because many asylum applicants don't apply until after they've already been in the United States for a year. You see, the rules say that to get asylum, you must apply for it within 1 year of your most recent entry into the United States. If you don't do that, you can't get asylum unless you qualify for an exception to the 1-year filing deadline. So, this question asks, are you filing this application more than 1 year after your last arrival in the United States? If it's been less than 1 year since your last entry to the United States, then mark no here. But if it's been more than 1 year, then mark yes. And then, per the instructions, use the blank space below to explain why you did not file within the first year after you arrived. The instructions also say that you must be prepared to explain at your interview or hearing why you did not file your asylum application within the first year after you arrived. Okay, so what kind of explanation should you be providing here if you're filing more than 1 year after having arrived in the United States? Well, just tell the truth. Explain why it is that you're just now applying. For example, did something change such that you didn't previously fear being harmed in your country, but now you do? Explain that. Or maybe you had significant medical problems or were very depressed during your first year here, such that you had trouble functioning, such that you couldn't really focus on your immigration situation. Explain that, okay? But let me offer a word of caution. The rules governing exceptions to the 1-year filing requirement are strict and can be kind of tricky. If you're considering applying for asylum more than 1 year after having come to the United States, you should really talk to an asylum lawyer. An experienced asylum lawyer can assess whether you have a realistic chance for establishing an exception to the 1-year filing deadline, and can advise as to how you may want to consider explaining yourself in this section. This does need to be done with care if you're filing more than 1 year after your arrival in the United States. Let me give just one example of how this can be explained in a very common scenario, where someone came to the United States as a student and has maintained that status the whole time they've been here. In that case, you could say something like, I believe I qualify for the extraordinary circumstances exception to the 1-year filing deadline, as I have maintained student status for the entirety of my time in the United States. That answer concerns one of the 2 main categories of exceptions, called the extraordinary circumstances exception. The other one is called changed circumstances. As the name implies, that's when something changes, such that now you're at real risk of being persecuted in your country. But again, this stuff is kind of complicated. It's best to speak with an asylum lawyer if the 1-year filing deadline may be implicated in your case. All right, with that, we're ready to move on. We are now at question number 6. It says, have you or any member of your family included in the application ever committed any crime or been arrested, charged, convicted, or sentenced for any crimes in the United States, including for an immigration law violation? Sound familiar? That's because it's almost the same as a question we already addressed, back on page 6, at question 2. That question asked about legal problems outside the United States, as where the current question, here at page 8, is asking about legal problems in the United States. The same guidance I gave for the question about legal problems in other countries applies here, for this question about legal problems in the United States, in terms of what kind of problems require you to check the box for yes. Note that the instructions below the answer boxes ask you for quite a bit of detail if you in fact answered yes. They say, for each instance, specify in your response what occurred and the circumstances, dates, length of sentence received, location, the duration of the detention or imprisonment, reasons for the detention or conviction, any formal charges that were lodged against you or your relatives included in your application, and the reasons for release. So, if you've had contact with law enforcement in the United States, or otherwise had legal issues, then try to provide as many of those details as you can. The instructions also say that you should Attach documents referring to these incidents if they are available, or an explanation of why documents are not available. As we discussed earlier for the question about legal issues in other countries, you should try to get certified copies of any arrest reports from the police, and of any charging documents from the prosecution, and any court documents showing how the case was decided, and what punishment, if any, you received. You can either provide those with your asylum application packet or submit them later, when you submit your declaration and evidence. Okay, one more note for this question. If you came to the U.S. border without a visa and had contact with U.S. law enforcement personnel, you should answer yes to this question. Why? Because you were, in fact, detained. If you were ever in a position where you could not leave if you had wanted to, even if it's like 20 minutes we're talking about, then you were detained. So you should check the box for yes. If that's you, you could consider answering in the narrative section below with something like this. I was detained by U.S. law enforcement when I came to the United States because I did not have permission to enter or be in the United States. To the best of my knowledge, I was not charged with a crime. I have never had any other legal issues in the United States. Now, of course, only say those things if they're in fact true. I just give that example because most people who come to the border are not actually charged with a crime. Okay, and with that, we're done with the questions and answers. Congratulations on making it this far in the training. You're almost done with the asylum application form. We're ready now for page 9, which is the signature page. The good news is that there aren't any questions to answer here. You just need to know a few things about this page before you complete it. So we're going to go over this real quick. First and foremost, you need to understand that when you sign this form and submit it to the government, you're promising that everything you say in it is true and correct. That's what it says in this chunk of text here at the top under Part D, your signature. It says that by signing, you're promising that the application and any evidence you submit with it is the truth. This text tells you that if you lie in connection with your asylum application, you can get into big trouble. In fact, it says that if you commit immigration fraud, you can be fined or even imprisoned for up to 25 years. That's right. You can go to jail for immigration fraud. So, before you sign and submit your asylum application, think carefully about whether everything you've included in it is true and correct. Remember, you should not lie, and you also should not include information that could be misleading or that is meant to cover up something bad. And let me highlight an important sentence from the next block of text, just below, which starts with the word warning, spelled in all capital letters. It says, applicants determined to have knowingly made a frivolous application for asylum will be permanently ineligible for any benefits under the Immigration and Nationality Act. What does that mean? Well, it means that if the government thinks you're lying as part of your asylum claim, you can be banned permanently from ever getting any kind of U.S. immigration benefit. So it's not just that you won't win asylum. Rather, you also wouldn't be able to get permanent residency in the event that you had a family member or employer who could sponsor you. And you wouldn't even be able to get a tourist visa to go to the United States in the future. So this is serious stuff. Last thing I want to point out from all of this text, it's the first line in this paragraph. And it says, applicants who are in the United States unlawfully are subject to removal if their asylum or withholding claims are not granted by an asylum officer or an immigration judge. This is a warning that if you don't have success with your asylum claim, you could be deported. If you get a negative decision from an asylum officer and you don't have legal immigration status at the time of that negative decision, you'll be put in deportation proceedings. And if you get a negative decision from an immigration judge on your asylum claim, unless you've got some other form of relief from removal available to you, you'll get an order of deportation and will have to leave the United States. Okay, it's true that you can appeal a deportation order such that you can keep fighting your case, but eventually you may have to actually leave. So, when you apply for asylum, if you're doing so with USCIS, you're kind of raising your hand and putting yourself on the government's radar. You're saying, here I am, and opening up the prospect that you could be put in deportation proceedings and eventually be deported. Just remember that before you decide to apply for asylum. Okay, moving on. Below the bolded text, there's a box on the left that says, print your complete name, and then a box on the right that says, write your name in your native alphabet. What's the difference here? Well, the one on the right is meant to ensure that the government sees how you produce your name in the form that it appears in your native language, using that language's alphabet, if it in fact differs from the Latin script used in English. So, for example, if your native language is Russian, you're going to put your name in the box on the right in Cyrillic letters, as if you were actually writing for someone who speaks Russian to be able to read it. So, however your name appears in your native language is how it should appear in the box on the right. And this includes languages that use the exact same script, or basically the same script, as English. So for example, if you're a native Spanish speaker, in this box, on the right, you're going to include the little tilde over the letter N, if your name in fact includes that letter in it. So what about the box on the left where it says, print your complete name? Well, you're meant to put your full name here in English, so do that. Now, what if English is your native language, or if your name looks the same when it's spelled out in English and in your native language? Well, it's true that writing your name in both boxes is going to be redundant. It's going to look the same both places, but that is what you should do. Do put your full name in both boxes, even if it looks the same or almost the same in both boxes. Notice I said full name. You should list your name exactly as it appears on your passport, except that the order should be first name or names, then any middle names, then any last names. So someone named Bill Bradsky Carl Smith would render their name like this. Question: if you're applying for asylum on paper rather than online, should you type out your name in these two boxes, or instead write them out with ink? Well, either way is fine, but I prefer the neat, clean look of typed text. So if you've been typing your answer up to this point, just go ahead and type out your name in these two boxes as well. All right, let's move on. We're now to the part where it says, did your spouse, parent, or child assist you in completing this application? You have to select yes or no to answer that question. If the answer is yes, then just below, you've got to list the name of the person who helped you over on the left. Moving to the right, you have to list the relationship. Frustratingly, the form doesn't indicate whether you're supposed to do this from the perspective of the family member's relationship to you or your relationship to the family member. I recommend that you do the former, that you say what the person's relationship is to you. So if your son helped you, you would write the word son here in this relationship spot and not father. You'll see that over to the right, there's an additional name slot and an additional relationship slot. This is for asylum applicants who get help with their application from more than one person who is their spouse, parent, or child. So if you had two such family members assist you in completing the asylum application, list the second person here. If you had 3 such family members or more, then you'd need to use the continuation page at page 12 to provide the name and relationship of each person beyond the second person. Now let's back up just a second to consider what kind of assistance is covered by this question. Like, do you need to answer yes to indicate that you received assistance? If your spouse just reminded you of a date or two that was called for up in the biographical information at page 2, such as reminding you of the date of your marriage, or maybe your child's date of birth. If it's just a few tiny things like that, then no, I don't think I would consider this to be the kind of assistance that's being asked about here. If someone sits at the table with you and works all the way through the application with you, discussing all or most of it with you, then sure, that's assistance. So you'd answer yes here. But what about help at a level between those two extremes? Well, it's hard to say, but I do think I would err on the side of caution and answer yes if you got much more help than just a couple reminders about biographical details. All right, the next question is similar to the one we've been discussing, but not exactly the same. It asks, did someone other than your spouse, parent, or child prepare this application? There are 2 things that are different here. First, it's asking about different people, covering everyone who is not your spouse, parent, or child. Second, the level of help being asked about here looks to be different. You see, in this question, they're asking whether someone prepared the application form for you, as where in the question above, they asked if your family members assisted you. I think that preparation of the application contemplates a much more robust role than simply assisting in filling it out. So, with the present question, I think they're asking whether someone pretty much filled out the form for you. Unfortunately, there are no instructions on point. They don't indicate what it means exactly to prepare the application form. But I think it's safe to say that if you hire a lawyer and they help you, then yes, you should consider them to be the preparer and accordingly answer yes to this question. Similarly, if you hired a so-called form filler or document preparer or immigration professionals or whatever they're calling themselves, and they filled out the form for you, then you should answer yes, because that's going to be considered preparation of the form by someone else. The same goes for anyone who actually typed the data into the MyUSCIS software for you, if you're applying online. They would be considered the preparer of your application. By the way, let me just stress how dangerous it is to hire a non-attorney to help you with your asylum application. I've seen many asylum cases ruined by these document preparers. Please don't let that happen to you. If you've made it this far in my training, then you're probably either doing this application yourself or will decide to hire a lawyer, so I probably don't have to worry about you working with a so-called form preparer. That makes me happy. All right, if you answered yes to this question about whether someone other than your spouse, parent, or child prepared the application for you, then you need to ensure that they complete Part E below. I'm not going to go into detail about that in this training, because your lawyer should know how to do this. If your preparer is not a lawyer, well, good luck. Last thing on this preparer stuff, the fact that you've watched this training does not make me or anyone at my law firm your attorney or your preparer. To be clear, this training is for educational, general information purposes only, and is not legal advice or even guidance specific to your situation. Accordingly, do not indicate on your asylum application form or at your interview that I helped you prepare the application. Okay, moving on. We're ready for the next question, which asks, have you been provided with a list of persons who may be available to assist you at little or no cost with your asylum claim? They want to know whether someone has given you a list of what are called pro bono or low bono lawyers that you could consider seeking help from with your asylum case. These are lawyers who represent clients for free or at a lower cost than what most lawyers charge. If you were detained by U.S. immigration authorities, then you probably did receive such a list before you were released. They normally hand this out with the packet they give you before sending you off. If that's not you, or if you did not get such a list or are not sure whether you did, then just answer with a no here. Don't worry, your answer to this question will have no impact on your case either way. All right, we're on the last step for page 9, and indeed for the whole asylum application form. As I said earlier, we're not going to cover Part E, which is for non-family preparers, and page 10 is not to be filled out yet. You'll deal with that page at your asylum interview or immigration court hearing. To be clear, page 10 should be left blank. Do not do anything with it. And we've already talked about pages 11 and 12. Those are continuation pages. So the only thing that's left to discuss is this bit at page 9, where it says signature of applicant. This is asking for your signature. If you're applying online, you'll just be typing your name. But if you are applying on paper, then you do need to sign, and you need to do so in black ink. Don't use any other color. No blue, red, or whatever color ink, just black. Note that the packet you sent to the government, if you're applying on paper, should contain the piece of paper that you actually signed with ink, as opposed to a scanned copy of that page. The government has been inconsistent on this issue, but you do run some risk of having your application rejected if you send in a scan of the signature page instead of the so-called wet ink signature, which refers to the actual ink signature you applied with your own hand. You're going to sign your name to the right of the little black arrow, ensuring that the whole signature fits between the two brackets. That's what the instruction below the signature line directs. It says, sign your name so it all appears within the brackets. To be clear, we're talking about a signature here, so you should sign in the same way that you normally sign your name in everyday life, which, for most people, is some kind of cursive or semi-legible scribble that looks more or less the same every time they do it. You should not be using print handwriting, which is sometimes called block letters, unless that's how you always sign your name. Just sign in the way you normally sign things with an ink pen, however that may look, and know that you do not need to include here your full name. I know I've said 100 times that you should render your name as it appears on your passport, but that instruction doesn't hold when it comes to your signature. Just sign however you normally sign, okay? Great. With that, the last thing to do is list the date on which you're signing the application. I do recommend using that date, the date on which you're signing, rather than the date on which you're putting your application in the mail or hand delivering it to the government. Your signature and application of the date should be the very last thing you do in filling out your asylum application form. Fill out all other parts first. Congratulations! You've completed Form I-589. That was a ton of work. You should be proud of yourself. Okay, I'm not going to go into the logistics of actually getting this submitted to the government, but I do want to make 2 final points briefly. 1, save a copy of your application form. If you're applying on paper, you should scan each and every page of not just the application form itself, but also any other documents you submit along with it. You want to have this in PDF format and save that PDF multiple places online where you can easily access it later. If you're applying for asylum online, then after you submit it, you'll have the option to save a PDF version of the submission. Definitely do that. You'll want to review your asylum application materials again before your interview or court hearing. Okay, second, and finally, if you do not speak English fluently, you need to have someone who speaks your native language read to you in your native language all the questions on the asylum application form and all the responses that you're giving. Like, someone who's fluent in both English and your native language needs to go through, line by line, and read to you in your language the question or instruction, and then the final version of the answer that you intend to submit. Why? Well, because you need to know and understand what you're doing. This is a very important document. You need to know what it says, okay? But it's also important to do this, because at your asylum interview or court hearing, the officer or judge will likely ask you some version of this question. Did someone read to you the questions and your answers in your native language before you submitted your asylum application? You see, it's problematic if you indicate on the form that you don't speak English fluently, yet you didn't have someone explain to you what's on the form, both in terms of the questions and your responses, which have to be in English. All right, you've made it. That's the end of the training. Congratulations again. I commend your diligence and am confident that the hard work you're putting into your case is going to really help you. If you do ever decide that you want help with your case, call my office, okay? We'll be happy to discuss your situation with you and tell you whether we think we may be able to help you. Our number is 713-909-0401. Call us now if you'd like to do an asylum strategy session with us, all right? Okay, thank you. I'm Brian Manning, and it's a pleasure to support you in your asylum journey.